It was always covered with a kisei, this mirror like a dead man in the house. If you came very close, you could see your reflection under the light-thin cloth. In general features, but 3 times a year when the kisei was removed to wash it, before New Year's Eve, Easter, and the first day of fall. The woman who did it tried to turn away or lower her eyes so as not to glance inadvertently at the mirror. Shortly before her grandmother died, Anastasia received a letter from her. "Come, the house is yours now. Remember about..." And then there was the drawing so familiar, the frame, and of course the mirror. What the hell? Anastasia had no intention of coming before, as her mother had done in her time. She was the first to flee the old house for good, breaking tradition. When the eldest in the family died, the next one took her place. The words home and clan had always been synonymous in their family. The house was built by my great-grandfather to a certain extent. The only important thing is that the house was born in the 18th century, and before it stood in a large village on a hill by the river. Then with time the river became shallow. A dam was built above, and now it was necessary to go down and walk far to the water, and the village was gone, and the town crawled close to the house and was already licking its eyes at the old building, already sending people to buy it for nothing and then tear it down. And don't be such a steely character of grandmother. In a word, all those who rolled their lips had to admit, yes, the monument of culture and the house itself and the garden around it, with arches, arbors, grottos, and fountains, too. Well, the mistress is an old woman, so we just have to wait. Her grandmother knew that she could not bequeath her estate to her daughter. She shivered at the mere memory of the house, with its traditions, silence, and things that gave her goosebumps. She ran away from it, as they say, with lard on her heels. In the end, my grandmother called Anastasia, and she came. She didn't intend to leave Paris, didn't want to return to Russia at all, but everything coincided. Her husband's betrayal, a long and painful divorce, her life shattered into shards, and Anastasia packed her bags. She knew what she was doing. The house demanded a renunciation of everything else. Serving it was becoming the main meaning of life. So in essence, in the state she was in, she had 2 options: to kill herself, or to stretch the process out over time, to let the house do it. Anastasia chose the latter. But now, 20 years later, she knew that her ministry was over because she had no children, and everything would be over with her. Those who would come here later might want to turn the house into a hotel or a museum, enchanted by its antiquity. The weather vanes on the turrets, the stained glass windows, the carved doors, and the black stone slabs. But the house won't allow it. And when the new owners realize this, having suffered 33 misfortunes, they will simply tear down every last bench, and there would be a wasteland instead of a house, a blank page of sorts. Anastasia hesitated further, though. Maybe the strength of the house is not in itself, but in the place on which it stands, and no matter what they built instead. And then Anastasia had a dream and realized it was too soon to despair. The one she wanted would be here soon. Only the dream was strange. Anastasia wasn't supposed to tell anyone about the new mistress of the house. But even if she did, there was no assurance that life would be as peaceful as before. The house had a premonition of something. It's still vague. That fall, my mother decided that they would winter at the dacha. Mom adored the dacha and the places around it. In general, it was a privileged place. It was a peninsula near the dam, which used to be a real island before it was built. One side were locks, motor ships, barges, yachts. On the other side was the river and the mountains behind it. My mother was once lucky enough to buy a plot of land and a dilapidated house cheaply from a woman who was leaving in a hurry, and she had to get everything done one day. Since then, from early spring to late fall, my mother worked here with enthusiasm. Every spare, and even not quite a spare rubble, went to work. But now there was a 2-story house, and the flowers delighted my soul until the snow came. In November, my mother always said goodbye to the dacha with regret, as if it were a living person. She walked around the house, stroked the walls, patted the door as if it were her own shoulder, and promised that in April there would be a new meeting. And this time she said, "You know what I'm going to do, Maggie? I'm going to winterize this place for you and me." Basically, the idea wasn't so crazy. Mom only needed the internet to work. The cottage had a great stove and several electric goats, so no one would freeze. The only thing was that almost all the dacha owners were leaving, and the store they had here was closed until the next warm season. "It's okay," Mom said. "I'll go grocery shopping once a week on a donkey." Donkey, she called their old car. "Well, you'll have to put up with your girlfriends," my mom continued. "You'll go to daycare for 2 days anyway, and then you'll be sick for 2 weeks. You don't get cold so easily. You're a hardened little man, but all these viruses." So they stayed and wintered well. Maggie didn't even notice the loneliness. It turned out to be happiness not to rush to kindergarten in the morning, but to lie in bed and look at the drawings on the carpet. Her eyes transformed geometric lines into fairy tale characters. Outside the window, it was slowly getting light. The outlines of trees were coming through. My mother was calling for breakfast. And the air was dizzyingly clear. The smell of strong coffee thickened, became palpable. The golden, sunny circles of scrambled eggs my mother sprinkled with green onions that grew on the windowsill, and the slight burning of its taste was a premonition of spring. And on New Year's Eve, the two of them hung twinkling curtains of garlands in the garden, and everything sparkled and shimmered like a fairy tale. But then, as if they had conspired, they turned off the unnecessary light, and then the stars shone brightly in the sky, and the thin sickle of the month promised them riches in the coming year. They only had to show him the silver money. They didn't go inside for a long time, mesmerized by the beauty of nature, and only when they were completely frozen did they come back to sit by the fireplace. Her mother brewed some willow tea, which grew in the neighborhood in summer, and she kept Maggie awake, telling her witch tales for a long time because New Year's Eve was a special night, and it was not supposed to be the night for sleeping. January, with its many festivities, slipped by, and in February the snow began to drizzle, and Mom made friends with the snow shovel, because otherwise they would have been prisoners of the cottage, unable even to reach the driveway. In March, near the spring, Maggie found the first flowers of the mother nephew, and in April, trouble came. Then they said it had never happened before and would never happen again. An accident at the dam, the one that rose above their peninsula. Dacha dwellers always waited for spring with apprehension. The hydroelectric power plant began to release water, and the amount of water it would release depended on whether it would flood the neighboring small islands, and whether the water would reach the houses and cellars. This rarely happened, and when everything dried up, the dacha owners had to start repairs. It was believed that the dam had a safety margin for generations to come, but no one could have predicted that there would be heavy rains in the upper reaches of the river, and the snow would melt so rapidly, and the hour would come when all the gates would be open, and the water would rush over the top, flooding everything around. The evenings were already long, spring evenings, and Maggie had gotten out of the garden unauthorized. It was a loophole she could not see from the house. She was going to look at the river water always fascinated her, and at this time, when it was swirling and foaming near the dam, when flakes of foam were carried by the current, especially at this time. So at this time she found herself at the water's edge. Perhaps if she had been older and looked to her right, she would have had enough sense to realize what was happening and had a couple of minutes to rush to the higher ground. But she didn't realize, didn't notice, didn't understand. And when the water surrounded her, picked her up and carried her, she was saved only by the fact that she knew how to swim. Of course, in the icy river, she would not have lasted 10 minutes, but next to her was the river's spoils, logs, planks, all sorts of junk, and you cover, maybe from someone's cellar, which became like a raft for her. There could not yet be any help. Those people who had just seen the flood were still recovering or calling any emergency services. And the water was so cold and the wind so scalding, when darkness began to fall before her eyes, Maggie only had time to wonder, could night come so suddenly? She felt sick. It was very hard to breathe. It was as if there was not enough air in the air. Someone's hand lifted her up and held her upright, but Maggie couldn't even hold her head up straight. It kept falling on her chest. "Have a drink," said the woman's soft voice. She tucked pillows under Maggie's back, made her comfortable, and sat down on the edge of the bed herself. "We have to move around a little bit, or we'll get congestion in the lungs. You have to finish this one." Every last drop. It was very difficult, because after each sip, Maggie fell asleep, or more accurately, fell into oblivion. In the end, the woman took pity on her and let her lie down as before and didn't bother anymore. But from that day, the first time Maggie drank from the cup, she began to recover. Now, every now and then, she woke up, looking at the objects around her and the woman who came toward her as soon as Maggie opened her eyes. She was tall, very thin, wearing a billowing dark dress. Her hair was combed smoothly into a knot. Her face was so stern that she seemed incapable of smiling. But sometimes she did smile, and when Maggie asked for food, she blossomed. She brought an egg on a little tray, some breadcrumbs, a cup of tea, and she started spoon-feeding Maggie. She put a breadcrumb on the spoon, dipped it in the yolk, and brought it to her. Come on, come on. Maggie felt that her teeth were soft, not even strong enough to chew dry bread. Still, her strength was returning, albeit slowly. The first question Maggie dared to ask, well, where's Mom? Where's Mom? The girl didn't ask. Neither what had happened, nor she was now. If her mother were around, none of this would matter. The woman brought her a newspaper. Maggie wanted to say that she could read only a little, and then only when the words were printed in big letters. And preferably those words should be short. But the woman did not suggest that she read. Then she unfolded the paper and showed her the pictures. There were many of them, and one was worse than the other. Maggie didn't recognize her Dasha village. It had turned into a garbage dump. Ruined, mangled houses, puddles of water everywhere. Mom, she asked pitifully. Lemon shook her head. It could only mean one thing. Mommy was gone. 6-year-old Maggie experienced such an acute sense of loneliness that it took her breath away. It was worse than when she was choking on pneumonia. Not only was it hard to breathe, but now she didn't want to live. My name is Anastasia, the woman said. You won't be alone, don't be afraid. You will be with me. It was a few more weeks until Maggie began to wander around the house, familiarizing herself with it. At first, she had to cling to the furniture out of weakness, but the faster her strength returned, the farther she traveled, exploring her new possessions. She liked the second floor best, a sunlit corridor with a view of the garden. Maggie opened the doors of the rooms one by one, and in each one she found a treasure. There was a piano, an ancient one, with candelabras and candles. There, a carpet, which was like a painting. A Turk in a turban was looking into a gazebo, where a beautiful girl was lounging on a sofa. Blessed that one of the doors was locked. The key was sticking out, though, and Maggie turned it carefully. She didn't expect to be able to handle the lock at all, but the key turned easily, and Maggie entered the room. It was almost empty. At any rate, the furnishings were most ascetic. A desk over which hung an old black radio, a stiff chair in which it must be very uncomfortable to sit, and Maggie thought it was the bride's veil, white, thin, on the wall. She touched it and heard a warning voice. Don't bother him unnecessarily. The girl recoiled. Instinctively, she realized that she had done something unauthorized and would probably be scolded. The key in the door was there for a reason. Of course, it was not allowed to come in. Still, she couldn't resist asking, "What's in there?" Anastasia lifted the edge of the kersey, turned it slightly away. Maggie saw the carved wooden frame. The wood had long since darkened. The frame was very old. The less you talked to that mirror, the better. Anastasia didn't scold her. Her voice sounded trusting. Anyway, it'll all be yours later, and you'll understand. In the meantime, don't come in here anymore, okay? She wasn't ordering, she was asking. And Maggie nodded in agreement. There's plenty of other rooms in this house to run around in, and walk as much as you like in the garden. But wait here, don't come here. Anastasia locked the door with the key and put it in her pocket. But not once since that day had Maggie even tried to break the ban. When she was older, though, it would have been easy to get to the room, like climbing that tree that grew under the window. But Anastasia didn't go there herself, and so there was nothing particularly interesting to see. The world that existed for Maggie now was limited to the house and the huge garden, surrounded by a high stone fence. She wasn't bored. It really was a whole world. A special man came to tend the garden, and it was always beautiful. Lots of secluded corners where you could hide from prying eyes, if there were any, and a little pond where you could feed the fish in the summer, and a swing, as if it were just for Maggie. Lots of roses, even green ones. The gardener was an old man, and he often stopped work to rest. At such times, Maggie would sit beside him, and he would tell her stories. She was especially fond of animal stories because the gardener gave the animals an almost human mind, and ordinary-seeming incidents turned into real tales. A cow and a pig conspiring to go to a faraway land, a dog performing real feats to save his owners. Maggie's eyes lit up. She would never leave Stephen Swan's side. In the long fall and winter evenings, Anastasia taught the girl various magic tricks. Modern people no longer spend time on this. Magic tricks belong in the circus. But Maggie had deft hands and a sharp memory. They started with different card games, like the simplest one, when one person chose a card and returned it to the deck, and the second had to guess what card is conceived. Then Anastasia started to show how to make an object disappear in your hands. There it was, and it's gone. There's the mirror for tricks, too, Maggie asked. You know, the one in the closed room? Sorry, "Do you know about the crooked mirrors?" Anastasia asked. Maggie shook her head. She had not had time to see this generally antiquated amusement. Like all girls, she played dolls, and the simplest games on a tablet. "Then I'll show them to you first," Anastasia said. "And then we'll talk about what you want to know." From time to time, they made outings. Anastasia realized that it wasn't entirely safe. What if someone she knew asked her about the girl? Or if someone from Maggie's former life recognized her? The search for those who had died in the flood had long since ended, and Maggie was numbered among them. If it had turned up otherwise, Anastasia would have gone to jail. It wouldn't have saved her from joining the angels if she hadn't pulled her out of the water. But Anastasia took the risk, and every now and then, of going out on the town with the girl, always away from where she lived, always for a little while. And when she and Maggie returned, both of them always felt the strangest feelings. When they opened the gate, it was as if they were stepping from the present into a past where roses bloomed and swings swayed quietly, where the fast, nervous 21st century had no entrance. Anastasia drove a machine that was older than herself. But Maggie was cared for like a living thing, and she still lived, and she drove them leisurely to wherever they wanted to go. This time they went to the park. It was not a work of designer art, but an old amusement park in the suburbs, a kind of excursion. Young people, like birds on perches, sat on the backs of benches, putting their feet on the seats. Along the alleys, the kids were taken on a mini steam train with tiny open cars. There were Devil's Wheel and Daisy and Illusion, in which it seemed that you were turning upside down and the ceiling, which should be at the top, was floating under you. The room of crooked mirrors was not popular and was empty. A full-figured woman, the one checking tickets, was bored beside her. Maggie instinctively sensed that Anastasia attached great importance to mirrors, so she squeezed her older friend's hand tight and the surety in vain. There was not a single person inside. Sunlight poured through the small windows in the ceiling, and dust flecks danced in it. Mirrors stood in a row, and Maggie moved from one to the other, watching her face and body change as they stretched, widened, and undulated. It was amusing, but no more. Maybe if the boys had been in Maggie's place, they would have laughed and pointed fingers at their supposed ugliness. But it took more than that to make Maggie laugh. The girl turned back to Anastasia and looked up at her, question. "It'll make more sense to you now," Anastasia said demurely. "In the meantime, let's go." They spent another hour or so in the park. They rode up on the Ferris wheel. Maggie felt as if the wind that ruled the city could pick her up and carry her as easily as it carried the painted autumn leaves. At an outdoor cafe, they ordered large portions of milkshake, Maggie a strawberry, Anastasia a chocolate. It was fun to dip the straw into the lush foam. In short, it was a wonderful day. And when they got home, Maggie never mentioned the mysterious mirror. In fact, she had forgotten all about it. She had enough to do besides. She was tired and slept so soundly that she didn't seem to move once during the night that she realized in the morning that her back and neck were stiff. However, after breakfast was over, Anastasia told her herself, "My DPHMs." Maggie realized what it meant and jumped up eagerly. When they reached the door that she had not opened since that one time, Anastasia unlocked it, took the key out of the keyhole, and put it in her pocket. "I won't lock it again." They stood at the mirror. Anastasia hesitated a little, and lifting the Keisel, threw it over the top of the frame. It was a rather large mirror, allowing me to see myself full length. It was a little tarnished from time, but otherwise it looked quite ordinary. The frame was the only good thing about it, the carvings so finely carved they were uncommon nowadays. A real weave of wooden lace. Maggie hesitated for a moment. She didn't understand why. She began, eventually, but she stopped her. "Look at our reflections," she said. Maggie began to gaze. Of course, her gaze was fixed on herself. After a while, she began to think that the girl reflected in the glass was more beautiful than she was. She had unusually smooth skin, and it was as if she had a slight gold cast to her skin. Maggie's features hadn't changed. It was undeniably her, but there were accents. There was a strength in her gaze that had never been felt before, and her whole appearance had taken on a marvelous harmony. It was hard for Maggie to take her eyes off her reflection. That girl in the glass was so good. She shifted her gaze to Anastasia's reflection and almost gasped. The simple face had turned into a countenance. A thin nose, perfectly shaped eyes, but there was no color in that face. It was waxy. Mirrors would do better if they reflected more. Or thought, Anastasia said thoughtfully. It's a French poet's phrase. It can be translated either way. Now look at this. She stepped back to the desk, where a chocolate-colored plush album lay on the table. Anastasia flipped through the pages and pulled out a photograph of a rather handsome middle-aged man. She turned the picture over so that the mirror would reflect it. A few moments passed and the man's face changed. His cheeks pulled back and sagged slightly, his lips curved, his gaze became different. It was the same man, but now his face was a complete reflection of his character. Overbearing, self-centered, intolerant. "That's my ex-husband," Anastasia explained. "Oh, but how does a mirror do that?" Maggie was amazed. "I don't know." Anastasia replied simply, "In my memory, it's always been there. Maybe it's older than this house. Maybe my great-great-great. I don't know how many times great-great-grandfather brought it from somewhere. But when you look at it, you start to see the real you. You can't hide anything from him. There are no secret movements of the soul for him. And I can't even tell if it will stay that way if you take it out of the house, or if it's the other way around if this place gives it its power. But there are two things you need to know that I will tell you. First of all, you can't take it out in public. It'll all be over at once. People will rush like vultures to investigate it, refute its power. Some will admire it, others will laugh at it, and it won't stand for that. That's why I showed you the crooked mirrors. If someone sees it by your carelessness, try to defend the mirror, say that it's just crooked, a toy for the public, and hide it the first chance you get. Secondly, avoid looking at him too much yourself. The longer you stare at him, the more power will bind you. What will happen to you? It's hard for me to describe. One time when I was looking at the mirror for a long time, it was as if something from it was transmitted to me. After that, when I looked at people, I could read their minds. I thought I was going crazy. I hung up the mirror as before and hardly ever went into that room, and gradually it went away, but it was scary to feel such power. It is not given to man, and he must not trespass on it. Maggie looked around with the directness of a child. And all the things in here are magical, right? The table and the chair. Anastasia grinned slightly. What magic? It's something that really exists, but we can't yet understand it or explain it. The table and chair are just ordinary. Only this, she tapped her finger on the radio, is a funny thing. It looked like a very ordinary, primitive device. Black plastic on the back, and the front part was white, slightly dusty. A frequency scale, a white wheel. I wouldn't turn it on, Anastasia said. Mo, with it, you never know what you might hear. Most of the time, it's just noise interference. If you rotate the dial slowly, you can get to a popular song or news, but sometimes voices begin to sound. Sometimes surprisingly clear, you can even hear the speaker's breathing, as if he approached from the other side and whispers in your ear. Sometimes the voice is distant, and it's not easy to distinguish the words, but it's always people who are no longer in the world. You know, there are things like dreams or warning dreams. This is kind of like that. And you don't just hear it, you have to interpret it correctly. Radio is a thing that should not fall into the wrong hands. Can I? Maggie's lips quivered. Can I hear my mom through him? Anastasia looked at her strangely. Baby, it's never by choice. It's always random. You don't get an answer to your direct question. At least I've never been able to do that. Well, let's give it a try. Maggie was ready to beg. Anastasia sighed and stuck the plug into the socket. Maggie's nerves were so excited that she flinched violently as soon as the receiver came to life and hissed. Anastasia spun the time-darkened wheel slowly, lightly touching it with her index. Weather report, wheezing again, an old song about a truck driver wheezing, whistling the noise, some sort of prize draw show, the deliberately animated voice of the host, failure, complete silence, and then a cold voice devoid of any intonation said, Metro. Now, Anastasia was already flinching. I don't think we'll hear anything more today, she said, but Maggie knew she would obey Anastasia and not disturb the mirror again. But if this room was not locked, she would sneak in from time to time and touch the wheel, move it a millimeter at a time, a fraction of a millimeter at a time, hoping that she might hear her own voice, that she might be able to send word, and not once did it happen. At first, Maggie found an opportunity to come here every day, if only for a few minutes. Then, frustrated and disappointed, she opened the door once a week, no more often. Songs replaced the news, sometimes bird song, sometimes a measured noise, as if there were a sea on the other side. And rarely, there were strange, ragged words spoken in a foreign voice. Words that Maggie didn't think had anything to do with her. Eventually, it became a tradition for her to come here 3 times a year. On her birthday, on her mother's birthday, And on the anniversary of the day, the water washed away what had been their peninsula, took away all her former life. Not only did Anastasia keep Maggie out of school, she tried to make sure as few people as possible knew the girl lived here. Anastasia started teaching Maggie on her own. She did it responsibly. Textbooks and the internet were helpful. She had to scribble down a lot of penmanship before she developed a beautiful handwriting. How many books had to be read before reading became a necessity for Maggie? She taught her French for fun, and so she wouldn't forget the language she said. And by the age of 16, Maggie was already fluent in 2 languages, almost mastered the high school curriculum. Oh, math, what a torture you are. Razor blade and the intricacies of gardening were not forgotten in tricks. Here the girl's abilities were undoubted, at least in the circus, to perform. Shortly before her death, Anastasia gave her one last gift. She went down quickly and unexpectedly to everyone. Anastasia had always been thin and never had a blush on her cheeks, but it seemed to Maggie that her older friend was as eternal as this house. She couldn't imagine her life without Anastasia, and the woman had never caught a cold in her memory. How had she gotten pneumonia without ever having been anywhere without freezing? But Anastasia came down with it all at once, in one day, and with the same fidelity as a beast senses the approach of the end, she realized everything about herself. Once a doctor was called to the house for once, and he administered treatment without anticipating a bad outcome, without even talking about a hospital. But Anastasia told Maggie, who was caring for her, "Sit down, I want to have a serious talk with you." Maggie was frightened. She'd seen that look on Anastasia's face only once before she'd taken her to the secret room. She noticed that there were folders on the chair next to the bed. Apparently, the sick woman had somehow made it to the closet where she kept documents and other important papers. "I blame you," Anastasia said. "I raised you like a Mowgli. And I'll tell you, because you can't lie to me anymore, that I did it not so much for you as for myself. I don't know how your life would have turned out, but if you'd been orphaned, I don't think they would have given you to me. There's so much paperwork, a line of people who want to take a child into a family. If I'm orphaned," Maggie repeated slowly, separating one word from the other. Anastasia nodded. "I forbade myself to learn anything about the fate of the flood victims. You were sent to me as a sign from above. At least, that's how I understood it. I don't have children, and this house should go from my hands to other loving hands. That's why when you came here, I was as quiet as a mouse under a broomstick, and you and I began to lead such a reclusive life. Tell me, honestly." Anastasia touched the girl's hand with her thin and this time very hot fingers. "Have you felt bad with me all these years?" But Maggie was in a state of complete confusion. What if her family was alive, and her mom was alive? Was that why she had never heard her mom's voice on the radio of the dead? Anastasia interpreted her silence in her own way. "I understand," she said. "Just know that I loved you very, very much. Like the daughter I never had. Okay, there's no time for feelings, so let's get down to business." Maggie couldn't help but hear Anastasia's heavy breathing. It was as if the woman was short of breath. Later, Anastasia, she didn't notice that it was the first time she had called her older friend so affectionately. "Don't do it now. You don't have the strength to talk." "There's no later. Look at this." Anastasia untied the first folder. "These are your documents. I paid a lot of money for them, and I don't think anyone will question their authenticity. But if you want to, if life works out that way, you can get real ones someday. In the meantime, here's your passport, which says you're Taylor Maggie, your high school diploma. We're almost through high school. In short, these are the first things you'll need. This is my will, and I give you this house. When I die, it will take effect. Next is a bank card. Don't lose it. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to get you by. There's a PIN code written on the envelope. You must memorize it." And this Anastasia put the last folder in Maggie's hands. "This is sort of an emergency airfield, the little apartment where I lived before I got married. Now it's yours. In case something happens to the house, they take it away from you, you'll still have a roof over your head. You don't have to take anything from here then, just 2 things. You know what they are." Anastasia leaned back on the pillows and took a few minutes, covering her eyes, trying to regain her breath. "And not to frighten you, but I must tell you about it too. Don't worry about the funeral. Our gardener will take care of everything. Your business is to enter your rights as an heiress as soon as possible. It shouldn't be too difficult. I have no other relatives." For the first time in Maggie's memory, Anastasia was wrong. At first, however, she didn't care about that. Left alone, she felt a real, great grief, perhaps even greater than when she'd lost her mother as a child. Anastasia had been her whole world, and now that world was dead. Maggie really didn't have to worry about anything herself. All the trouble of the funeral was taken care of by others, both the old gardener and the staff of the bureau. The funeral service was held in the farewell hall. Maggie realized that Anastasia didn't want to let any extra people into the house even after she died. There was a tired, stern face in her coffin, and it seemed to Maggie that now Anastasia was listening to someone to them, the living, invisible, and what he was saying she did not like. To the girl's deep sorrow was joined also anxiety. And when Maggie went back to the house where she had spent most of her life, it seemed vast, desolate, and gloomy, a veritable crypt. Never before had it evoked such associations. Fleshing what Anastasia had feared began almost immediately. Someone was keeping a close eye on the old manor, and they weren't about to let it fall into the hands of a young owner. Red subway came up again. The very first word she had heard on the old radio. The city was about to build new subway lines. In this connection, people living in old houses were decided to be resettled. They said that these buildings would not withstand the underground works. But one could not think that prestigious places in the center would be empty. They would be sold at a triple price. The houses would be demolished and replaced by company offices and shopping centers. The settlers will be sent to the suburbs. They're going to build economy-class high-rises especially for them. And the mansion where Maggie lived fell into one of the new neighborhoods planned for construction. She was a pain in the ass. Maybe there are some states in the world where old houses whose owners don't want to give in to change are left alone, and new freeways circle them, and neighboring huts with futuristic buildings. But this was clearly not the case here, and Maggie began to receive commissions which could not be prevented the more these people behaved in a hostile manner. And the end of land committee inspector, a skinny tall man with a small bird's head of some kind, told Maggie, "You will be compensated. The cadastral value of this house is not very high." He mentioned a ridiculous amount. "You can, of course, sue, but you will only lose time." "You mean they'll take the house away from me?" Maggie asked naively. Her interlocutor shied away from answering. "You should look for a new place to live," he said. "You realize that the urban development plan has to be fulfilled." Maggie didn't listen any further, but the gardener told her that evening that there were rumors that the authorities had other plans. "That's a very nice house. You can't find a house that old nowadays. They'll tell Maggie it's not a cultural monument, or maybe they won't even make any excuses at all. A lonely girl and a quiet, shy one at that is no match for them. And here, it seems, they're going to make a hotel. A river nearby, a small park in the garden. Old windows will be replaced by plastic ones." Maggie even shook her head, imagining this picture. And even before she started the fight, she realized she was going to look. People came every day now. They seemed to have things to do, some to sign, some to clarify. But Maggie knew they wanted to see the inside of the house. Anastasia wouldn't let anyone in to see if there was anything to eat. "You won't sell these chairs?" asked the visitor. And the statuettes. A vase. Things a lot. It is unlikely that you will buy yourself such a large apartment to fit in it all the good, and in the antique store to drag far in troubles. Let's give you a good price right away. Maggie didn't have a shred of commercial savvy, and she still didn't consider herself an antique owner. Anastasia was. There was only one thing Maggie felt responsible for, and that was to remove what was in the secret room. She still hadn't let anyone else in here, though there had been people who wanted to. "What have you got in there?" Another guest pressed the doorknob seemingly casually. "Nothing. My personal belongings," and Maggie touched her fingers to reassure herself, touching the key that was now always in her pocket. And then the guy from the land committee told her that the will was invalid for some reason, so the house would go to the state and Maggie would not be compensated. The girl only looked at him with big, frightened eyes. She was completely defenseless, and the official named Bonds understood it. "No. So you can only bring your personal belongings with you," he said. Maggie realized that she might not be allowed to take the mirror out of the house. After all, its frame, its wooden lace, was a work of art, and someone might want it. She ordered a new frame, the simplest, made of pine. When it arrived and the gardener brought it into the room, Maggie would not let him do any more work. "I'll do it myself." She stood in the doorway, not realizing that she was like a nurse, that no one was allowed to care for a contagious patient. If there were going to be consequences, it would be for her alone. Maggie walked over to the mirror, sighed deeply, and tugged the cloth off. She'd been at it all night, either consulting the internet or despairing at her own clumsiness. In doing so, she was careful not to even casually glance at the glass itself. The mirror seemed to her to be the judge, from whom it was impossible to hide anything, and she was afraid to see herself with a face contorted with confusion and fear. But it was impossible not to touch the mirror, impossible to move away from it, and Maggie began to feel something happening inside her. Sounds became especially distinct. She could hear a mouse scratching somewhere far away in the house. Ladies, and the colors became clear and bright. The dawn appeared in all its splendor as she stretched out her legs, which were already aching mercilessly. Maggie walked to the window and froze, thinking that she had never seen such beauty. The shimmering colors of the rising sun. The birds singing. Maggie covered her face with her hands. She thought she couldn't stand it all, that she was going crazy, but there was one last thing left. She carefully set aside the disassembled old frame, wrapped the mirror in rough paper, tied it with strings. She hid an unattractive black and white radio in a bag. As she approached the door, she already knew that the gardener was going up to the second floor, and that he was not pleased with the way she had hesitated. That's it, he wondered, looking at what she was about to leave the house with. A wheeled bag with stuff, a small purse with documents, a plastic bag with something, apparently light in weight, and a mirror which no one could touch now. Just an old glass. That's it, Maggie confirmed. Can you please call me a cab? Here's the address. She had never been in the apartment, the keys to which Anastasia had given her not long before the end. Truth be told, Maggie was in such shock that now she didn't care where she lived. She'll stay here, she said to the gardener. You will tell them that I have vacated the house. I am gone. She waved her hands, and again the gesture was helpless. Maggie could easily read the gardener's thoughts. I could take something from here for myself. There's money to be made for antiques. Take it, Maggie said, as a memento of Anastasia. You were good to her, and your garden was so beautiful. She ran down the stairs, leaving the man standing with his mouth ajar. First, the ride was across town. Maggie settled into the back seat and supported Mirror carefully, like a child. She didn't want the cabbie to help her carry her things in, though he offered. The worst thing was that the apartment was a one-room apartment. I mean, no meters didn't matter to Maggie, but to live with a mirror in one room. Then she saw a built-in closet in the hallway, and with a sigh of relief, she placed her burden there. Didn't even unfold the paper. Then she closed the closet and put a hook on top to make sure. Anastasia hadn't rented the apartment to tenants. No one had been in here in a long time, and the air was stale. It smelled like dust, if dust could have an odor. Or was it Maggie's sensitivity now, like a sheepdog? The girl opened the shutters and only now began to look around. It was the most ordinary apartment, and the current aesthetes would undoubtedly call it murdered. Wallpaper and floral in the room, furniture from the 20th century, a wall unit, and a few crystal vases, a sofa covered with a plaid plate. The kitchen made it especially clear that Anastasia lived here alone. A couple of small pots, a teacup forgotten on the table, a single stool beside a small table. Now her loneliness, like a baton. Anastasia has passed her loneliness to Maggie. The girl went to the window. That's what was fortunate about this house, the place where she stood, on the corner where the boulevard ended and the square began. A fountain with bronze figures of children, and behind it, a theater building, columns, arches, a real palace. I had to start living, everything from scratch. To go to the store and get at least bread, tea, and sugar, wash the dusty curtains, put things away. But Maggie hesitated, staring at the building that reminded her of a palace. She knew something was about to happen. The feeling was so clear that a chill ran down her spine. She needed to stop being a Robinson at heart, to end the involuntary reclusiveness she'd been living in all these years, to get to grips with all the things she still didn't know, to understand what stores she needed and how she should behave in them, what and where in this big city, how to use transportation. Maggie's situation was worse than that of a foreigner, the one who didn't know the language but understood some general principles, drew parallels. Maggie was perfect, a blank slate, and she didn't have a single familiar soul in this city, only scrappy, vague memories from her childhood of what and how things should be. For she had been very young then, she had just turned 6. Her first forays into the world had been closer to traveling to another planet than walking around town. She found a bakery on the first floor of her house, and that's where she went. Not knowing the value of money, she always bought very sparingly. But there were days when she made do with bread and milk. At moments when she was worried, her appetite was turned off completely. And now she was always shivering because of the abundance of new impressions that life had prepared for her. But almost every evening she found an opportunity to sit by the window. At 7 o'clock the play began in the theater, and on the eve of the performance, cars would arrive. Dressed up people would rush to the entrance and climb the steps. Maggie had never been to church, but something similar, reverent, she felt, emanated from this palace. And the expression temple of art was unfamiliar to her. And yet, unable to resist what was urging her to go there, she bought the ticket. It was imperative that she should go in with the others. She had not much in the way of outfits. In fact, these modest things could not be called outfits, except for a black silk dress which she rarely wore and which looked newer than the others. The last time Maggie had worn it had been to Anastasia's funeral. As she arranged her hair into a simple style, she hesitated for a few moments. There was only one mirror in her apartment, a small one in the bathroom. The only thing she could see in it was her face, and even then in the dim light, and she needed to know what she was like. And Maggie knew who would tell her the truth. She went to the mirror, whose silent presence she had always felt, and lifted the tulle she had draped over it. A thin, almost ethereal girl stared at her inquisitively. She looked like an illustration in a book. The big eyes and the hands, the outline of the head, the neck, exactly like a graphic. Maggie sighed, both convulsed and relieved. She realized why the mirror saw her that way. Subconsciously, she feared that grief, confusion, helplessness had disfigured her soul. She'd already realized by now that it was the soul that the glass reflected. But no, she had not yet found herself in the world, absorbing what she saw, forgetting herself. And the mirror made her look like that, like a stroke of a pen had drawn her now, and still she was good. A quarter of an hour before the performance began, she walked through the doors of the theater, immediately joining the stream of spectators. Never before had there been so many people around. They crowded in the check room, strolled through the foyer. In fact, there was nothing special about this theater that would make it stand out from the others. Stairs to the second floor, and from there, the entrance to the balcony. At the foot of the stairs was a small winter garden and a pond with goldfish. A buffet in the corner. There is music, laughter, and colored lights. Because Maggie had just looked in the mirror, she saw very vividly now, in fragments, as if she were moving from one picture to another. Here was a hand with a crystal glass, a straw rising from the white foam. Here was a fish wagging its tail in the mysterious depths, and the tail was translucent, like a golden plum. The doors of the hall opened. Everything was full of expectation, premonition. Maggie entered timidly, as if she was not sure whether she had the right. The place where the miracle would be performed, she felt it. But it was impossible to fully immerse herself in this impression. She had to find her row, her place. Finally, she sank down into the red velvet chair and froze, hardly breathing. The performance made an overwhelming impression on her. It must have been a long time since anyone cried at an old operetta. Silva had been in this theater for years. But Maggie was mesmerized by the music. Tears came to her eyes, and she was sitting near the stage. And when Silva threw the edge of her bow on her shoulder, a scarlet feather fell into the girl's lap. Maggie clutched it in her fingers in a purely mechanical gesture. Almost from the very beginning, her gaze was fixed on the actor who played the protagonist. Maybe he matched Edwin in years. He was older, but in acting, everything is conditional. Maggie saw a tall, statuesque man with noble features, and how he gave his hand to the heroine. It was tenderness. To the fingertips, the tenderness that makes the heart stop. Maggie had a bad realization that the play was over and she had to go home. She could still hear the music, still be there. And at home, she could think of nothing else but the magical fairy tale unfolding before her eyes. And never before had she had such dreams as she had that first night. From that day on, Maggie became a regular at the theater. There was a ballet and an opera, but she always went only to the operetta, where the poster bore the name of the artist whose image now appeared to her as soon as she closed her eyes. Week after week, month after month, Maggie lived like that. She tried to do things during the day, still bought herself some meager food, looked for a place that would hire her. But things didn't work out, and the people who refused Maggie were understandable. The girl gave the impression of being weird. It was as if she was looking at you, but she saw something of her own, and her lips smiled slightly. The unsure lady asked her bluntly and rudely, "Are you sick?" Maggie shuddered and looked as if she had woken. "No." "What did you say?" "That's the very thing. We have production here, workshop. Everyone has to be attentive. And you're dreaming in some clouds. No, you can't even go to the factory as an apprentice. Maggie realized that the money was running out. Meanwhile, the city was preparing for the new year, dressed in sparkling garlands, and the words Happy New Year could be heard more and more often. It was only a couple days before the holiday when the frost hit. What a frost! You couldn't run from store to store, your fingers were glazed, and it seemed like they were going to break off like icicles. And it was necessary that, taking her jacket in the check room after the performance, Maggie heard the two girls in front of her discussing whether it was worth waiting at the exit to ask for an autograph or whether it was too cold and better to go straight home. Eventually, they decided to wait, and Maggie realized she would join them. She didn't need an autograph, but to see the man she thought about day and night beside her, oh, that would be a precious gift. They came out of the theater, and the frost immediately burned their cheeks. Everything around them was as bright as it is when the thermometer drops below -30. The headlights of the cars, the lights of the advertisements, the lanterns, the Christmas tree in the square, the stars in the sky. The sharp rays of light crashed and poured in from everywhere. Maggie's eyes were watering, but she was afraid to blink, lest her eyelashes stick together from the frost. The girls wore fur coats and warm gloves, and she wore a jacket with fish fur and a knitted cap. And yet, bored and cold, they were ready to leave, and she mentally asked them to wait because alone, without them, would not dare to approach the artist. Her sacrifice was endless. She was ready to stand like that all night long. The second wave. The audience had long since dispersed, began to leave the theater, those who had taken part in the performance. Maggie was afraid of not recognizing them, of missing out. All her hope was in these girls. Maggie knew that they were waiting for the same person, and so the girls hurried towards someone, slipping. The granite slabs in front of the theater were icy. Taylor did not come out alone. He was accompanied by a short, stout man, wearing a gray coat and an Ushanka hat. Evans. Maggie heard the young voices. The girls surrounded the artist, slipping him programs, their heads close together. Taylor wrote something and complained that the ink in the pen froze in the cold. Maggie moved closer, forgetting everything as she listened to his voice. And then the girls, laughing and thankful, hurried to the bus stop. It was a stone's throw away, and the artist looked at Maggie. "Baby, what do you want?" An autograph. From excitement, and the fact that she was freezing, Maggie couldn't even utter a word. Taylor's companion was also looking at the girl. He was about 45 years old. Plain, unimpressive face. The artist had gotten serious. "Baby, you got someplace to go?" Maggie could have pointed to her house across the square, not 2 steps, but 1.5 steps. But she was shivering like a puppy. She would have been shivering like that if it had been a hot summer. It was all about who was talking to her. The men looked at each other. "We'll go with us," said Evans, concerned and yet very gently. "At least you'll have a warm night's sleep. You'll be cold here by morning, child." Later, Maggie learned that there was nothing surprising in the artist's behavior. He came from a theatrical family. His father also played, and his name was known. And do not count how many families have survived the tour, semi-poor conditions, sometimes lived in poor hotels, and Mom Evans took care of young artists, as if, and really was their mother. She took care of dinner, took care of things. Long ago there was no mom in the world, but Taylor remained her favorite son. And in an instant, the seemingly forgotten was resurrected, and he acted the way she would have acted. It turned out that the companion was an old friend of his, a journalist, and both of them were glad to meet each other. It was warm in the car. Maggie settled into the back seat and listened to their conversation, not really getting into it and not really believing what was going on. Taylor lived in one of the old houses on the same boulevard that had become the local arbit 30 years ago. In the 90s, the tenants of the apartments on the first floor had been forced to move out, some by kindness, some by threats, and now it was all small. And the boulevard was decorated before New Year's Eve as beautifully as any street in the city, and the lanterns created an illusion of the 19th century, and the imagination could easily conjure up horses, carriages, ladies in long dresses and furs. "Evans, do not start any variety. I have an ulcer," said the journalist. And our guest should be poured hot tea by all means." Maggie sat in the big room on the couch and put her hands between her knees, trying to keep warm at the same time, and to make sure no one saw her fingers shaking. Evans, what a hostess, took his time sacredly making tea and, "Sit down, don't help me," cutting cheese and sausage. If the journalist didn't want to eat, The girl was undoubtedly hungry and needed to be fed. She looked so exhausted. He filled her plate himself, poured tea into a large mug. The men talked for a while. Maybe they wanted to give Maggie a chance to come to her senses, or maybe they'd gotten carried away and forgotten about her. Maggie caught bits and pieces of phrases. They talked about new plays, about some famous guitarists who were passing through their town. Evans wanted to hear them, but he didn't have to. "And I sat in their hotel room all night," said the journalist. "Vincent got carried away and played one thing after another." "No, tell me why you came to me," Evans said suddenly to Maggie, and she, who all these months had not told anyone anything about herself, really began to tell, rambling, confused, sometimes stopping for a long time, choosing words, then finding them, then not finding them. She didn't hide the fact that she'd grown up in the old house that was the stuff of legends. Blushing slightly, she said that Anastasia was a distant relative who had replaced everything for her. Her friends, her classmates. But now Anastasia was gone, and Maggie had no joy left but to live an illusion. Evening after evening to forget about everything while the performance is going on and you can drown in this music, live, breathe it. And Maggie does not need anything else. Well, and she has no work yet, although it was not worth mentioning it at all. It is only hers, Maggie's problems. When she stopped talking, Taylor looked at his friend. A movement of his eyebrows. "What's up, Thomas? You know what occurred to me?" Even said, "My sister-in-law and I don't get along very well, but as they say, we observe politeness. We try to do each other favors. She has her own beauty salon, and there, as far as I know, there's a turnover. It's not about the salary. The lady's character is very bitchy. But for the first time, don't you want to try? I'll write her a note. It's impossible to reach her on the phone. There are conversations going on all day long. Try it, girl, and then we'll think of something else. And every time I hope that you will say that Ilan is yours, divorced." Said the journalist. "I always thought that Leanne, on the 10th husband, will not stop. She will go head over heels, climbing higher and higher. Leanne will be the end of the road for her. I don't know who will be able to find a common language with this bitch." Still, Maggie waited a few days, didn't go anywhere, didn't inquire about a job, gathered her courage. The New Year's holidays helped her too. Everything was closed everywhere you looked. And then the money ran out completely and irrevocably. She couldn't ask for alms, could she? She found out the address of the beauty parlor and went. Maggie always walked now, even if the ends were large. She told herself that this way she would get to know the city, which was still unfamiliar to her. And there was nothing else to do but sit at home. On the way, she convinced herself to hold firm. The worst that could happen is that she would be rejected. But life didn't end there either. Then she would look for something else. Besides, she had a note from an old artist. Evans seemed such a deity to her that she could not imagine who could refuse him. But she found it amusing that he was Taylor, and she was Taylor by her new surname. It was like a roll call in space. Or maybe Anastasia, sensing something, had chosen that name for her. Maggie encouraged herself. But when she saw the modern two-story building, she was afraid again. It looked like an expensive and very large cube, the kind of thing a giant might play with. She glanced once more at the address she had written down on the paper, hoping that it was a different house. No, it was a beauty parlor. Maggie sighed, clenched her hands into fists, and started up the steps. The door opened in front of her, sending a wave of warm air through it. Maggie walked in and froze, not knowing where to go next, who to turn to. At the reception desk sat a girl, very young, pretty, in a uniform green robe. She said hello and asked if Maggie had an appointment, and if so, who did she have an appointment with? "I'm about the job." Maggie had to cough and repeat the phrase. A second girl came up to the receptionist, white, tall, statuesque, her hair in a ponytail. Judging by her robe, she worked here too. She was obviously going to say something, but when she heard Maggie's words, she just snorted. And the receptionist was still trying to remain polite. "What did you want to be? Do you have some kind of education? Maybe you're a beautician, a hairdresser, manicurist, anything." Maggie felt a pleading note in her voice. "No, I didn't go to just high school." "Me? She wants to be a cleaning lady," explained the redhead with a ponytail to her coworker. "No, I don't think we have any." The receptionist began. "Girl," said the redhead contemptuously, "you should start somewhere else. Like waving a rag at the train station. Here you have to fit in, you know, like came to us and transformed. Clients shouldn't see people like that from the street, you know." Don't you look after yourselves at all? Maggie was so hurt, so confused, that she didn't even think of running away and slamming the door. But slamming the sliding door wouldn't have worked anyway. But then another woman entered the lobby, and Maggie immediately felt both women pull up. It was impossible to ignore her, and Maggie couldn't take her eyes off her for a few seconds either. The woman was young, short in stature, but with a regal posture. Her black dress emphasized the whiteness of her skin, and her hair, also black, fell in waves over her shoulders. Her lips, painted with bright red lipstick, were striking. The woman looked like an actress from an old movie. Or maybe she was just looking like Dita Von Teese. Island Bush, the redhead with the ponytail, began. Maggie realized that before her was the owner of the salon, the same Leia with a bitchy character. The girls obviously wanted the scene with Maggie did not attract the attention of the boss, but she was already looking at Maggie and raised her thin eyebrows, waiting for an explanation. Maggie didn't have to look for the note, all the while clutching it in her pocket. And this is probably for you. She held out a piece of paper. Island Bush unfolded the piece of paper, took one look at it. Her expression didn't change, and she seemed to make decisions quickly. "Are you going to be a cleaner?" she asked. "You have no education, and we have no other vacancies." Maggie nodded hastily. "You can go out tomorrow. At 8 o'clock, you'll come with your documents to Kate." She nodded at the receptionist. "She'll show you what to do." Aileen Bush crossed the lobby with a swift step. There was business waiting for her somewhere out there in the parlor offices. The girls were silent. Maggie nodded awkwardly at them, but there was still silence in the hall when she went outside. It is wrong to think that the work of a cleaner is the easiest. Anyone can do it, and that it doesn't take much skill to wag a rag. In the first days, Maggie was afraid that she would be kicked out with a bang. There was so much to remember, so many little things not to miss. After all, she had seen all these jars with cleaning and disinfecting agents for the first time, and now every day she had to do like a general cleaning in offices, halls, toilets, and not a speck of dust, not a speck of dust. Perhaps she worked harder than she really needed to. She stayed when everyone had long since gone home, and before she left, she would go over the surfaces with a white handkerchief to see if it was clean. One time she was even pitted by an elderly security guard. "You live far away," he told her. "Where are you going to go across town now? You don't have money for a cab yet, I know. Lie down here on any sofa and sleep till morning." But Maggie looked at him with such frightened eyes that he just waved his hand and said, "Do as you please." And she was afraid of any arbitrariness, any violation of the rules, in case she was about to be pointed at the door. She saw her first job as the only one in the world. She had no idea where she would go if she was chased out of here. The salon soon stopped noticing her. She was so mute, wouldn't say a word. She never objects to anyone. She nods and does as she's told. "Girls, we have a cleaner, some kind of patient, Nora," W.I. said to her coworkers, red-haired Laura. "Well, the one from the fairy tale about Morozko. She's actually Maggie," the hairdresser objected. "Well then, Maggie's patient. Before her, it seems. No one here with a mop and a rag could hold out for long. The salary is 3 pennies, but our loca asks for a lot. Let's see how long this one lasts." However, Laura immediately forgot about the cleaning lady. In her opinion, she was not worth even a mop. Maggie kept her eyes on her. She especially liked to watch the makeup artist at work, though she only did it surreptitiously. Sometimes, as Maggie walked by, an unassuming middle-aged woman would sit in the chair. And then Maggie would meet her in the lobby when the client was getting dressed, and the girl couldn't help but notice how much better looking she was, as if she had partially regained her younger years. And there was a sparkle in her eyes, and one day Maggie couldn't take it anymore. When she was cleaning Camelia's makeup artist's office in the late afternoon, she sat down in the chair herself, touched her eyes with a brush, then her eyelids, touched her eyelashes with mascara and her lips with lipstick, and stared at her transformed face for a long time. The next day, no one noticed her imposture, and since then Maggie had occasionally allowed herself to steal. When there was no one else in the salon but her, she painted her new image. She had only glimpsed Camelia's work, but she tried to imitate it, and she couldn't believe herself. She was becoming completely different. Mature and very beautiful, she was now coming home so tired that the only strength left was to take a shower, drink tea, and sleep. The mirror hung like that, covered in a dull haze. Sometimes, if Maggie woke in the night, she thought she saw someone in white standing in the corner. She was startled for a moment, then remembered what was in front of her and closed her eyes again. Once, when she thought her makeup came out particularly well, she dared to lift the cloth and look at herself, and she shuddered violently. There, in the looking glass, she was exactly as she had been before, very young, without any makeup. Just a girl of 18, thin, with big, frightened eyes. But the room behind her was not reflected, as if it were not there at all. It was just darkness. It frightened Maggie, and she hastily put the towel back and stepped back with a pounding heart. There was no reason, though, no reason at all. The salary, which the girls scornfully called 3 pennies, was enough for now. At work, Maggie immediately changed into her uniform and stayed in it all day. Work and home, she never went anywhere else, and she had nothing to spend her money on. She had not yet seen for herself the temptations of the big stores, and now there was no energy left for the theater. Surprisingly, after Evans had talked to her, she was no longer as eager to go to plays as she had been when she had breathed them. Maggie knew now that she had been given something more. She could call Taylor. He'd given her his phone number and talk to him, to himself, not stare silently out of the auditorium at his character, like not just her, but the entire audience. No, she hadn't dialed his number, but she had it, which meant that at any moment she could pick up her cell phone, and already that made her feel happy. She spoke to him mentally, and for now that was enough to say that evening. She didn't realize that Aileen Bush had stayed in her office. Maggie was about to finish her work when she heard someone enter the lobby. The guard said hello and was answered by a male voice. Surprisingly, the visitor, who had come in at an odd time when none of the masters were present, was not asked to leave. The visitor walked down the hall toward the office where Maggie was finishing mopping the floor. The girl hurriedly bent over. The partition separating her from the corridor was made of glass, and Maggie saw a young man in a light-colored coat with pleasant and somehow familiar features. "Good evening," he began, and where they looked at each other. Maggie was a little confused, wondering if she would be guilty of something. The young man looked as if he were enchanted. Working this late. He didn't know what to say, and it was obvious he'd said the banal words just to avoid being impolite. "And you were looking for..." And immediately she realized who was in front of her. This is what Evans might have looked like when he was younger. "So it's Aileen Bush's husband," Maggie said, what she didn't doubt. "No, she's probably long gone. And if you see your father, please thank him for me." "But we agreed to meet here," said the young man, "and you are the girl my father told me about." So he hadn't forgotten about her yet. And Maggie's lips trembled. She was trying to hold back a smile. So they looked at each other and smiled. "Well, I guess if it was about a tramp freezing outside the theater, that's me." About me, heels tapped on the stairs. Aileen Bush was coming down. One glance at Maggie was enough for her to notice and appreciate her makeup, and to understand its origin. "You'll put $3,000 in the cash register tomorrow." She had been addressing the girl as you for a long time. "If you touch the cosmetics again, you'll be fired." Maggie turned away hastily to hide her flaming face. She knew she wouldn't reach for the jars and boxes on Camelia's table again. Wouldn't even look at them. She'd gotten herself in trouble after all. "Nolia." The young man began with a soft reproachfulness. Maggie remembered his name, Erlan. Elon Smith. But Aileen Bush did not wish to pay any more attention to this episode. She talked about her own business, about some accounts, and was the first to head for the door. Aileen Smith, with a guilty glance at Maggie, followed when the girl was alone. The guard in the lobby was not to be counted. It seemed to her that her strength had run out all at once. She didn't think she had enough to finish cleaning. She sat hunched over on a bench in the hallway for a while, and then she scrubbed the floors. And then she literally walked home. It was snowing, beautiful big flakes. There was no wind, and the snow was falling so slowly that it looked like a curtain connecting heaven and earth. I wanted to sit down and not go anywhere else. And for some reason I wanted to cry. No matter how tired Maggie was that night, she could hardly sleep. She shuffled back and forth on the narrow, hard bed, desperate to get up and not even doze off yet. She got up, dripping valerian, the only medicine she had, and then anger replaced the sadness that brought tears to her eyes. So rather, a stray thought struck her, but it won't come true. It probably won't come true. Maggie ran to the bathroom, took a small mirror off the wall, breathed on it, and wiped it thoroughly. Then, holding it in her hands, she held it up to the larger mirror. After all, she herself, looking for a while into the magic glass, is charged with its power, then maybe, and the ordinary mirror will take over her, at least for a while. Maggie stood like that for a few minutes, and then looked in the small mirror. It worked. The same reflection was looking back at her as in the big mirror. Maggie knew that soon enough it would all be over, that the cheap glass would be left to itself. But she hoped what she had planned would succeed. And who would be able to expose her in that case? That evening, as she finished her work, Maggie didn't think about the makeup or camellia. None of it interested her anymore. She left the landlady's office for last. She left, taking from Aileen Bush's desk a small mirror on a stand, an expensive Italian mirror that was always on the salon owner's desk. Maggie left the mirrors to talk to each other overnight. And in the morning, as she tucked her mistress's piece into her purse, she felt that it seemed heavier. Maggie arrived at the parlor before anyone else and managed to put the mirror back in its place unnoticed. She closed the office and hurried downstairs to her den, to the rags, the brushes, the vacuum cleaner. She recognized her boss's footsteps immediately. Only Aileen Bush wore such high heels to work. There were voices in the corridor, girls greeting the mistress. She answered them. There was Aileen coming up the stairs. For a while, silence. But Maggie was now as if she were all sharpened to hear. Her hearing was suddenly so sharp that she marveled at herself, and she heard it, that suppressed, horrified shriek. Maggie couldn't help herself, opening the door to the stairs. She knew she couldn't go into her boss's office. She knew she couldn't go into the supervisor's office unless she really shouted enough for everyone to hear, and then she could go in with the crowd. But it was impossible not to find out what had happened. Maggie had barely made it to the second floor when there were false footsteps. Maybe that's how zombies walk. Dumb pause. Dumb, 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 pawn, pause, dumb. The office door opened, and Aileen Bush appeared on the threshold. Her eyes were halting. She was groping her face and looked absolutely stunned. No way, no how. She had discovered a fatal disease. And she ran like a girl to the end of the hall. Maggie realized where she was going. There was another mirror hanging in the bathroom. She couldn't know what her superior saw, but she could clearly picture it. The fixed round eyes of a bird of prey, the leathery skull, the disheveled hair, a wicked grotesque of what she thought was the most beautiful thing in the world. And after all, Aileen Bush, when the first acute impression is past and she is convinced that she has not lost face, she will not even be able to arrange a reprimand to the girls. No one brought anything to her office. Just her favorite mirror, which stands in the same place, played a cruel joke. Maggie was cleaning as if nothing had happened when the female employees began to whisper that the boss felt unwell, called a cab, and went home. I couldn't even drive myself, can you believe it? God, maybe she'll take a sick leave at least once in 100 years. Will at least rest without that vulture, was heard from all sides. You can't wish for bad things, it'll come back to you. Let's wish her a trip around the world for about 3 years, to steady her nerves and ours. For girls loved Aileen Bush. I'll tell you that. In the evening, when Maggie was finishing cleaning, Ilan arrived unexpectedly. She flinched when he opened the door. What did he want here? His visit seemed to be nothing but trouble. Now she knew for sure that he hadn't come for his wife. Aileen Bush hadn't been here since this morning. Yes, and Ireland, as soon as he saw her, Maggie took his hat off his head and went to her with the sweetest smile. I wanted to apologize for yesterday, he said. I know that Leia can behave very unpleasantly to others, but maybe it's the laws of business to be tough. Otherwise, you can't reach the heights. I realize it's no consolation to you, but let me at least compensate you for what you had to spend because of my wife. You haven't done anything wrong. I understand, a young, beautiful girl. It's impossible to resist emphasizing her beauty. Len took some bills out of his wallet. Maggie recognized them. They were red $5,000 bills, and placed them on the dressing table. Maggie's eyebrows flew up. This is for you. A little more for moral damages, as the lawyers say. Maybe you'd like to buy yourself some perfume or something, some trifle. I'd be very glad to know that you've forgiven this unpleasant episode and are not angry. I'm still not taking it. How's Evans? The first phrase came out in a shorthand, the second eagerly. Every piece of news about Taylor, even in passing, was precious to Maggie. No, Father. Rowan apparently didn't know how to switch so quickly. I've seen him for quite some time. We mostly talk on the phone. He seems to be doing well. Playing. Maggie sincerely could not understand how, having all the opportunities to be near such a man, and she did not see Taylor's equal now, one could not value it. Exchange it for something else. For talking with Aileen for some TV or club, time was running out, and you could never make up for what you had wasted so ineffectively. At the same time, she felt that Irlan was talking to her in a special way, with unusual interest. The girls at the salon would have said hitting it off, but knew how indifferent she was to all this. It happens. Both are young, good-looking, and one of the parties makes every effort to sow some kind of spark, but in vain. There's no fire, not even a small one, not even the light of a candle. "Take it, please," Maggie said, gently placing the bills in Irish's hand and squeezing his fingers. "And don't torture yourself. I'm not angry. I really am." Taylor got married very early, while still a student in the vocal arts department. He was considered one of the best there, but he knew he was unlikely to see the Capitol stage, unless a miracle happened and he was invited. From other future singers, Evans differed unprecedented for actors' modesty. He realized that his voice was good but not unique, and he was categorically incapable of chewing his way out of a seat. Therefore, he had no doubt that if anyone would make it to the big stage, it would be less talented, but certainly more self-confident guys. All right, let it be a provincial theater, as long as he was given the ones he dreamed of. In his senior year, he was already involved in performances at the local opera and ballet theater. And there he saw her, Lara, a future ballerina who had the most beautiful legs in the world. He was coming up the stairs, and she was coming down to meet him, to go to her wing, which was the classrooms where the students of the choreographic school were engaged. He saw her singing feet, as he called them afterward, and could not take his eyes off them. He began to look for an opportunity to meet her, but she seemed to be avoiding him. She didn't answer the notes he passed with the other guys, the ones who were braver. And when he got her number and tried to call her, she wouldn't answer his calls. Her conversations can please. No, I hate being looked at like a circus horse. I saw where you were looking and what you were looking at. But that's the first impression, he excused himself. I saw the face and the soul. Only a little later it was when they were both involved in the same play, and he put all the flowers he got. And he was playing the main character and the bouquets didn't fit in his hands. At her feet, when they married, his teacher jokingly rebuked him for putting a cross on his future. If you're married, you'll lose half the interest, if not most of it. Why don't you want to keep the audience intrigued for longer? Look at the characters you play. Can you remember a single play that starts with a happy wedding? That's the finale, and that's where you've chosen to start. But Taylor didn't care what anyone thought of it. He knew that he had met the only woman in his life, that he was a one-woman man, and that it was fate. But it turned out that Lara didn't think so at all. As it turned out later, Lara was attracted by the prospect, a young, handsome, talented artist from a famous family. Lara was still very young and thought that fame and a well-to-do life would come with the package. But then everything went wrong. Ireland was born, and immediately, he and his father were to blame for everything. Lara suffered at once. Figure, career, and ego. Her to return to the former form could not manage. In the theater, she was not expected at all. Unlike her husband, she was still only a corps de ballet, where no one would notice her absence. And to sit in the apartment, so simple, ordinary, to do the usual household chores, Lara shuddered. She was always acutely aware of how short a woman's life was. And a missed day was like a missed year to her. A year of tantrums, hand-wringing one nanny, another, and the old freedom doesn't come back and no roles are given. And how sickening it is to stand over pots and take up the mop. Eventually, Lara ran away. Island was not yet 5 years old when she left her son with the nanny, a note to her husband, and disappeared so suddenly that if it hadn't been for the note, a manhunt would have been launched. Lara found herself much later. In the capital, somewhere there, she settled in theater circles, quite possibly not as a dancer, but as some kind of administrator. The main thing, in the art and in the right circles, that she is going to remarry. Evans learned when his wife asked for a divorce. But who became her next companion, and what ended her struggle with everyday life? This was not even rumored. Taylor, on the other hand, continued to consider himself a one-woman man. He saw nothing good in it. Rather, he thought of it bitterly as ugly. Take, for example, those dogs who pine for years and wait for their master's return. If the whole canine species were like that, it would be extinct. We need to shake things up and get back on track, but Taylor couldn't. He found a nice older woman who cared for Igor like a grandmother, and she settled into his home for many years, gradually becoming a member of the family from a nanny, a theater, and a son. That's all Taylor's life was made of after Lara left. But the longer time went on, the more friends he made. His sincerity and charm, the complete absence of star disease, care for others, and the aura of great talent, which could not help but feel All this made it so that people were drawn to him, and a certain circle was formed. Undoubtedly, Evans hoped that his son would be his main friend when Ireland grew up, but the young man almost repeated his own fate. He married very early in a frank bitch, except that neither theater nor talent Ireland had, and God knows what kept his soul. Taylor could not find out. Leah was doing her best to limit communication between father and son, fearing bad influence, that Ireland would ask for freedom, but there were others. The same Thomas Adams, who also lost a son, only hopelessly the boy died. Thomas also reached out to Taylor for comfort. People of different professions and different characters in the house of the artist found that place where material things remained behind the threshold, and only what was valued in childhood and youth. Kindness, nobility, dreams, matters. Soren said that Taylor has his own mafia. Remember the Godfather, Evans? Don Corleone solved all his cases through friends, acquaintances, relatives. Only most people owed him something and paid the debt. You too. No matter what you have, whether you get sick, whether you need help, you'll find everything you need from your friends. But your mafia is not based on fear and duty, but on love. Maggie was one of the first to notice him when he came in again, but she hoped sincerely that he was not here to see her. She was in her office, and the salon was full of customers, but she was not going to be complimented by Alan Smith in this atmosphere, or to be handed that unfortunate money again. Nevertheless, it was to her that Ireland headed. "Please," Maggie said, "I told you. You don't have to give me anything back. It's really my fault. So it's a normal fine." "I'm not here for that at all." Ireland looked very tired and gaunt. "Father is ill. Can't you be his nurse for a few weeks?" he asked. "If you can." Of course, Maggie's voice was clear. She was ready to go right now without even putting on her jacket. "I don't care if she loses her job. What about him?" An intermittent sigh. There was no play in Irish's gaze now, only anxiety. And Maggie was looking at him just as anxiously. "Doctors are diagnosing pneumonia. For now. You know what could happen with that diagnosis. Anyway, there's no way to know yet. There's a doctor there every day. A nurse comes in to give shots. But you need someone to be with you at all times." "Are you on the machine?" Maggie asked. "God, what a fee. What are you talking about?" "Don't hurt me." The next 2 weeks were probably the hardest in her life. The disease was ready to win, to take the artist with it, as it had already taken many and many. The doctor was from the same mafia. From close friends, came twice a day. The nurse came even more often. Her name was Isabella, and as Maggie realized, she had been in love with Taylor before. Isabella knew her work perfectly. She had a light hand for injections, but as often she had tears in her eyes, which is not typical of nurses. Maggie, Siri, in addition to night duty for the sick man, took care of the household. One day, when Evans had fallen asleep, she and Isabella, both drunk with fatigue, were drinking tea in the kitchen. "You know, he's so simple, so kind, so available," Isabella said. And Maggie knew she was talking about Taylor, but he doesn't really want to love anyone else. And he's built this ice wall between himself and the people around him that's thin, transparent, you can't see it. But it's there. I tried, figuratively speaking, to press my whole body against it and melt it, but I couldn't. I just froze myself over and over again. And it hurt so much to thaw. Maggie was given strict orders from the doctor to take her temperature and saturation every hour, and if anything, to contact him at any time of the day or night. And then call an ambulance. Evans didn't complain, only said once with a guilty smile, "I keep looking for a pose that will make it easier to breathe. My lungs feel like they're flooded with water." And then he had, "Children, don't worry. I've lived long enough. Don't worry about me." That day it seemed to her that an even more difficult time was coming, and that the end might be near. So Maggie decided to go home and get some things so that she could stay here permanently. A few changes of underwear, the little things you can't do without if you're not in your own house. Maggie had everything she was going to take with her in a quarter of an hour. And then, she didn't know why, the movement was purely mechanical, automatic. She plugged the plug of the old radio into the socket. Every time she thought it would never come to life again, never make a noise. But it always woke up. There was a whistling sound, and then rustles, noises. Maggie spun the wheel slowly. "Take the mirror to him," Anastasia said suddenly, as if she were in the next room. Maggie flinched so that the receiver almost fell out of her hands. "Am I going crazy?" She asked either herself or the radio, and almost immediately asked the question she thought she would never ask. "Anastasia, what about my mom?" Maggie hadn't thought of her mother in recent years, but now, as the emptiness approached, and no one would be by her side. "She's not here," Anastasia said. "Forgive me both, you and her." The noise came again, and it was so easy to imagine that it was all Maggie's imagination that she was beginning to have some sort of auditory hallucination from fatigue. And then she walked over and, biting her lip, began to remove the mirror from the wall. The Taylors' apartment was crowded until the evening, and this despite the fact that the doctor had forbidden all but the most important people to come, but there were quite a few of them. Besides his son, whose place was in any case here, there was Isabella, and also that partner who had sung with Evans for many years, and Thomas, who could not be excluded. But few people went into the room of the sick man himself. They crowded into the other rooms and into the kitchen, making tea and coffee, talking quietly. Everyone is surely waiting to say goodbye. Maggie's heart broke. But the sick man was dozing all the time. He didn't call out to anyone. Finally, near midnight, Maggie was the only one left in the house besides Evans. Usually this time was the most precious to the girl, but it was also the most difficult. She alone was responsible for anything that happened to Taylor during these hours. The sick man was half sitting up, covered with pillows, breathing hard, but each time he asked Maggie not to sit beside him, but to go to bed. "Put my tea on the table and go," he pleaded. "I promise. If anything, I'll call." He's not strong enough to call, Maggie used to think, but he's delicate enough. He'll try to go to the afterlife quietly, so as not to disturb anyone. And she distracted Taylor as much as she could, asked him about plays, about roles, about familiar artists. But often, when he enthusiastically began to tell, she noticed that he was choking, and then began to talk about anything herself, as long as he didn't chase her away. But presently she brought him tea, and immediately went out and returned, carrying back the heavy thing. "No, what is it?" Evans asked quietly. The disease wouldn't let him speak any louder. "Mirror, look at yourself. You want to show me how sick and ugly I've gotten." Taylor stroked her arm with dry, hot fingers. "Maggie, I already know. Don't, really. You were welcome." Never had such a pleading tone been in her voice. And he looked. There was silence. Maggie looked not at the mirror, but at Evans. At first his face became more and more stern even. It was the way one might look at an approaching storm, at an enemy on the offensive, and at the last line beyond which was eternity. Then his expression changed now. Evans looked as if he was eagerly waiting for the judge to pronounce a verdict or acquittal. And finally, tears came to his eyes. Then Maggie stepped back and looked too. He was very young there. That Taylor remained a child at heart, she knew. But now it was confirmed. Maybe only a little older than she was, about 25 years old, but no more. Not a king, but a prince. And yet, it was undeniably him, impossible not to recognize, and his gaze was both trusting and wise and something else. It was as if he knew everything, as if he'd been where Anastasia was now. Evans sighed convulsively, but as deeply as if the air had finally broken through his chest. "I'm out of breath," he said, not believing himself, "but I can't be like this. If I am like this, then all of life is justified. It means that in what I've experienced, I've kept my soul." Maggie cried, covering her face with her hands. She felt as if she were the one who had been pardoned. "No, Thomas," Evans said. "I'm done with the stage. After what I've been through, I'm tired and out of breath. But that's not the point. I still want to live, all my life in art, in the realm of shadows, in imaginary images. And life slipped through my fingers. Now, as long as I am destined there, I want to go out on the grass in the morning, to walk barefoot on it. I want to plant a garden, damn it. I want to go to the sea, not during the time free from touring, but when I want to see it." "That's quite a gift you've given yourself," Adam said. They walked slowly, turning from one garden path to another. Evans had sold his luxurious bar apartment, withdrawn his savings from the bank, and bought the old house. "It's not a gift for me," Taylor said seriously, "or rather, it's not just for me. It's primarily for her." Maggie was in the house, fiddling with dinner. "And of course, nothing will change for you," Evans went on. "All my friends can come to see me whenever they like, as long as they like. We'll have a table here in the garden, under the awning. Oh, what evenings we'll have. I think the house has learned a lot, too, in the time it's been in other people's hands. It won't be so unsociable now." "You look a lot younger than you used to," Adams looked at his friend, and an involuntary smile touched his lips. "We were scared for you back then. But it turns out your illness has done you good." Taylor patted him on the shoulder. They were silent for a moment. "Now I'm waiting." Evans couldn't procrastinate any longer. "Did you find her?" Yes, the journalist took a piece of paper out of his pocket and handed it to him. Maggie's mother's alive. She moved to a neighboring town, probably didn't want to see a place where everything reminded her of. She never married again, no children, working home, lives pretty much reclusive. Here's her address and phone number, of course. I didn't tell her myself. That's between you and Maggie. I should probably be the first one to call, Evan said worriedly. It would be too much of a shock if she heard her daughter's voice right away. And Maggie should be careful because she doesn't know yet either. Of course you don't die of joy, but if she could die, it was when we were all afraid for you. Do you remember what she was like then? She was black all over. Now I regret turning down the hospital, and she saw the whole thing. I should have gone in there behind closed doors, but then she wouldn't have saved you, Adam said simply. So this whole chain, the whole thing, since that terrible flood, not one link in it was random, as nothing is random or meaningless. Maggie's voice came from inside the house. Now that she could breathe easier, she made coffee and hummed something simple because she knew the old house wanted to hear living voices. Mike sat on the bleachers of a large gymnasium and watched with admiration his 17-year-old daughter, Darla, who at that moment showed wonders of flexibility and artistry on a makeshift arena made of mats. The girl lightly made a long silk ribbon obediently curl around her slender legs, and then made a sharp turn, threw the handle from the ribbon in the air and deftly catch it when her body gracefully rotated around its own axis. The hall was immediately deafened by applause, and a happy smile broke out on Darla's face. Waving goodbye to the audience, the young girl left the mat and her performance ended. "Dad, what do you think?" Darla asked her father with excitement in her voice as she tightened the laces of her light-colored sneakers. "What can I say? You're a professional, honey. A real fairy on stage," Mike said, smiling. "If I hadn't seen you plow 10 hours in the gym, I would never have thought that all those fluttering with ribbons. It's such a hell of a lot of hard work." "Oh, come on." The girl shrugged. "Standard workouts. I don't have anything special. The Olympic champions are the ones who work with such dedication that I never dreamed of in my worst nightmares. Can you imagine that they sometimes sleep only 4-0 a day and then go straight to training? And this is a flutter compared to them. So, a mere amateur." Darla shook her head, and her father gently stroked his daughter's arm instead of saying anything else. He knew very well how important rhythmic gymnastics was to him and how much time and effort his girl devoted to this beautiful but incredibly hard activity. "You're always downplaying your efforts and your talent," Mike said softly. "You remind me a lot of my mom. She, too, doubted herself every time it came to putting her paintings up for sale in galleries. Always afraid of large-scale exhibitions." Darla looked at him with slight sadness. "If you only knew how much I miss her, Dad," she said wistfully, adjusting the antique silver bracelet on her arm, the only memory of her mother Alina that she had left after her death. Her father had once given his fiancée this lovely bauble as a token of his love, and she had never taken it off since. When her daughter turned 12, Mike gave her the bracelet. Alana and the girl, just like her mom, wore it on her right hand all the time. "Honey, you performed just fine. Mommy would be proud of you." "Believe me," her father assured her. "After all, it's still just a preliminary screening. You have plenty of time to hone the elements you're not completely sure of." Darla looked at her father with genuine gratitude and love. "You know, I'm incredibly lucky to have a father. You're the best daddy ever." The girl put her arms around her father's neck and lightly pecked his cheek. "Are you going to go to work again now?" "Yeah." Mike stretched out with a sigh. "What do I do if my managers can't close a single deal without me?" Father and daughter look at each other understandingly, and then laugh amicably. Both of them knew perfectly well that no managers had anything to do with it. It was just that Mike, being a successful businessman, liked to plan everything on his own and make deals. That's why he often stayed in his office until the middle of the night or traveled for weeks at a time. The businessman did not trust his business to anyone, even his most trusted people, and preferred to keep control over everything that happened inside his company. The same kind of humor helped him further diffuse the situation at times when his daughter would have loved to spend a couple more hours with her father. Darla realized, however, that this was sadly not possible. "Okay, thank you for coming to the checkup today," she said to Mike. "It meant a lot to me, really. Daughter, remember one thing, you will always be my priority, no matter what happens, always." The businessman repeated again. After that, the two of them got into his luxury car and drove to Mike's country mansion. After dropping Darla home and saying goodbye to her, the businessman went straight to his office. He had an important case scheduled for today, and he really hoped that luck would favor him this time. The partners from France, with whom the businessman had long dreamed of concluding a contract, finally paid attention to the success of his firm. Now, Mike very much expected to conclude with them a very favorable deal for himself. While he and the driver were driving, the man involuntarily plunged into his own memories. Few people, looking at this another man of 45 years old, would think that he was born and raised in the most ordinary family. However, that is exactly what happened. Mike's parents worked at the same factory, his father as a welder in the hot shop, and his mother as a cook in the factory cafeteria. It was not easy for young Mike to work his way up through his own social environment. The guy dreamed of big money and serious business practically from childhood. He did not fit in with the ideals of the so-called working youth of those years. Someone considered him an upstart, and someone directly called him a loser and warned that the desire for more will only come to him in a bad way. And Mike shouldn't get involved with anything more complicated than construction tools or blueprints and a dial. However, young Mike did not consider it shameful to be an upstart among his peers and went steadily towards his goal of stratification of business. At home, Mike was not very supportive either. But his father, unlike his mother, who was terribly worried about the future of her not moderately ambitious son, at least believed that the boy can still do something. "You shouldn't be so worried about him, Catherine," said John, Mike's father. "He's a smart kid who studies all day long. He'll be a good kid in the big city. So now he has to spend the rest of his life at the factory with us, mowing his health for nothing." Catherine only shook her head and wept. "John, dear, look at him. What kind of businessman is our son? It is so not serious. He's so puny, so weak. He even got a certificate of exemption for physical education. They'll torture him there, and that's all." Still, Mike was absolutely sure that what he had planned would work out, and therefore he was intensively preparing to enter the Faculty of Economics all summer after graduation. The hard work and desire of the guy was eventually rewarded. Having entered the budgetary place in the university, Mike immediately moved to New York, where he was even allocated a room in the student dormitory. The mother of the guy to the last did not believe that her poor boy leaves to conquer the big city. However, her spouse explained to her that such a smart and talented guy, as their son was, just did not understand. "Catherine," John tried to reason with her, "he has absolutely no future here, unlike in the big city, where he can put all his calculating skills into practice." Catherine still cried as she did so, but eventually resigned herself to it. She sincerely wanted her son to succeed, and he would find his happiness in a noisy and bright metropolis. Over the next 5 years, Mike pleased his parents and his teachers with success in his studies. The guy was considered one of the best students in his course at the university, passing each session only for excellent grades. Mike's father was very proud, and his mother began to realize that her husband was right. They were already making grandiose plans for their son's future when a terrible tragedy happened in their lives. Both spouses died in a terrible fire that occurred on their property. The fault of drunken neighbors. They had a party in their house and did not watch the stove. And at night, the fire broke out with terrible force and immediately spread to the roof of John's bathhouse, which stood right next to the neighbor's house, separated from it only by an old fence. When Mike's father woke up and rushed to put out the fire, it was too late. The bathhouse was almost burned to the ground, and the flames were starting to reach Catherine and John's house, trying to knock down the fire. The couple used up all the water that was on their property and wanted to give up this thankless task, especially since the fire department was in no hurry to come to their remote village. The husband and wife tried to take out of the fire all the most valuable money and documents for the house accumulated over many years of hard work. At that moment, a heavy floor beam collapsed on them with a terrible rumble. The police, who then arrived at the scene of the tragedy together with specialists, stated that it was an accident. Mike's parents died almost instantly, and there was no one to blame for their deaths. Mike, who was then in his final year of university, learned about the death of his parents and went into severe shock. He could not eat for several days, and during the funeral and the wake that followed, he could not utter a single word. Grief tearing at his broken heart. And the young man wanted nothing and expected nothing more from his life. The death of his nearest and dearest people seemed to finally undermine him, destroying all the joy and purposefulness on which he only lived all the last years. A week after all that happened, Mike discovered the first gray hair on his temples. At that moment, he finally realized that his youth had come to an end and that now he was an adult. After returning to the city, the first thing the young man did was to sell his parents' property. He did not want to return to the village ever again. Too many difficult events had happened there, and Mike wanted to close the door to that part of his past forever. To settle the land, the future businessman delved back into his studies, trying to ignore the pity in the eyes of his classmates. Now, the main goal of the young man was to finish the university with a red diploma. So he wanted to honor the memory of his mother and father and prove to himself that he could still achieve his goal. Otherwise, all this and study and his move to the big city was for nothing. The only person who supported him all this time was his girlfriend, Alana. She studied at the same course as Mike, only she chose the Faculty of Art History. The young student was crazy about painting and architecture and even drew very well herself, but she never believed in her own strength enough to switch from the study of art to its direct creation. Alana admired the endurance and perseverance of Mike, so when he almost broke the story of the death of his relatives, the girl did everything possible so that her beloved did not feel lonely. It was then that Mike himself first thought about how strong his feelings for Alana. Realizing that only she alone was for him all this terrible time support, Mike decided and made his beloved a proposal. "Will you marry me?" Mike asked in the courtyard of the Philharmonic after they left the concert early. They both found the concert terribly boring. To make his words sound more solemn, the guy got down on one knee in front of his beloved and handed her a small, open heart-shaped box covered with red velvet. Inside, on a snow-white silk pad, lay a gold engagement ring with a tiny, but sparkling like a star diamond. "Oh my God." "Mike," she gasped delightedly. "How lovely." Mike looked at her expectantly and with some tension in his gaze. Elena forgot herself for a moment, slightly bewildered by the unexpectedness of the situation, but then exclaimed happily, "Yes. Well, of course, I agree. My love." The lad was greatly relieved. Just in a burst of feelings, she spun in a light dance, after which he tenderly kissed his bride. After the wedding, life flashed new colors for Mike. The first thing he had to do was to find a job that would allow them to rent a good apartment and continue the cultural lifestyle to which they had become so accustomed during their time as students. So, having collected his documents and diplomas, the guy went to interview in all decent firms, where they were ready to consider his candidacy for a place as an economist or financial analyst. After the third interview, he was accepted in a promising young firm, which was engaged in the supply of building materials throughout the country. And it was in this company that the man subsequently worked until the very moment he was asked to head it. Alana also did not intend to sit on her young husband's neck, and therefore quite quickly found a place as a staff guide in one of the capital's museums. Yes, it was not as prestigious as the work of a real art historian, but it was certainly better than running on all fumes waitress in some cheap eatery, while your diploma is dusty on the shelf and does not bring any benefit to society. Young people worked hard and then could disappear all day long somewhere in the theater or at fashion exhibitions. For some time, the couple lived, as they call it, for themselves, enjoying feelings in each other's company. This was not very much like the parents of Alana herself, who constantly pressured their daughter with requests to give birth to their grandchildren. However, the girl was resolute in her intention to get on her feet first, and then already engaged in expanding her own family. "I don't like these progressive views of yours, daughter." Every time Elena's mother came to visit her daughter and son-in-law, "We're doing quite a lot of things with our father, aren't we? When do you want us to take care of your little ones?" "Mama, you don't have to get along with anyone," she smiled. "Not now, not later. Mike and I are grown, independent adults and are quite capable of raising our children on our own. If we need your help, it will certainly be rare. Don't worry." Alana's mother pressed her lips together and looked at her daughter sadly. No way had she thought she would be faced with her own daughter's reluctance to have children in her old age. If they were adults, they would have babysat long ago. Or instead of going on and on about culture, how much more can we do? Ashley, though a native city dweller, was a member of the so-called old-school crowd. She didn't understand why her daughter and her husband didn't live like the normal daughters of her friends. Why don't they give birth to fat, flexible babies whose laughter would drown out the expanse of their large one-bedroom apartment from morning to night? "You seem to have completely forgotten what a woman's true mission is, don't you?" her mother asked Alana, looking at her reproachfully. "Mom, don't start, please," Alana begged her, "so I'll remind you." "I don't mind," Ashley continued, as if not noticing her objection. A woman's mission is to give birth and nurture and pass on all her experience and love to the next generation. Alana clutched her ears with her hands each time to keep from hearing the same thing. Alana's mother had worked as a middle school teacher all her life and had given birth to Alana herself very late by the standards of her friends when she was already over 30. However, as soon as she started such a conversation with her daughter, it would immediately appear that she had good reasons for it, which you see Alana herself lacked. I promise you, when we decide to have a baby, you and Dad will be the first to know, Ashley replied tiredly. Her daughter was unable to go against her stubbornness. But how long do I have to wait for you? The woman said, and then abruptly turned the conversation to some other topic. Mike and Elena spent several more years childless before they felt ready to have a son or daughter, and I was 28 years old at the time. But despite some concerns from doctors about her age, the woman was successful with their future daughter for most of her term. Of course, at first she, just like all pregnant women, was tormented by a little toxicosis and swelling in the first trimester, but all this passed quite quickly, and then Alana felt just fine. By that time, Mike had become a successful top manager in his firm, and the general director warned him that he saw him as his future successor. He said that only such a person as Mike would be able to provide his company with a decent development after he went on a well-deserved vacation. Mike then took the words of his boss with all responsibility and was ready to work 2 or 3 times as much if the company's business required it. At the same time, he was not going to miss the birth of his wife, about which he warned management. The director reacted surprisingly calmly, to such an extent he trusted his best employee. So he gave Mike something like a mini maternity leave during the... Elena was already choosing a name for the baby when the news of Ashley's death suddenly broke. Mike received a call that day from Alana's father, who told him that his wife had had a heart attack during the night. Mike was devastated by the news and for a while didn't know the best way to tell Alana. He was very worried that such a shock could adversely affect the condition of the child. So at first, he even thought not to tell his wife anything before the birth so that she did not worry. However, nothing came out of this idea, as Elena very quickly realized from his face that you're hiding something from me. I can see it, she said to Micah as she lay in the labor room, stroking her large rounded belly. Realize by not telling me anything, you're only making it worse. Her husband looked at his beloved wife, and in his eyes, Alana saw regret and pain. What's wrong? The pregnant woman asked him again, more insistently, or something with my parents. Don't be silent. Tell me. Mike sucked in more air into his chest before slowly speaking. Dear Alana, you just don't worry. Your mom? What? What is it? She said, pale, even though she had already realized that she was in trouble. She's no longer with us, Mike said quietly, lowering his head. For the next few moments, Alana sat silent and unmoving. The man began to worry if she had gone into shock, when her spouse suddenly exclaimed several times, and with the words, Mommy, Mommy, honey, why did you leave? She burst into tears at the top of her voice. Mike tried to calm her down as best he could, but quickly noticed that his wife's sobs had at some point turned into painful screams. So he called for a nurse, and the nurse, after a cursory examination of Alana and probing her abdomen, stated that she was in labor. Oh God, it hurts. Alana cried out once again as she was wheeled on a gurney to the delivery room. Mike had been there the whole time, saying something encouraging to his wife, though now, after so many years, he couldn't remember exactly what it was. He wasn't allowed to go to the operation. So Mike was forced to spend the next few hours in the corridor, sitting on a hard, uncomfortable chair and listening to the incessant cries of his wife from behind the door. The businessman remembered that at some point his nerves got the best of him, and he simply passed out. He came to his senses only after the doctor who delivered Alana shook him violently by the shoulder. Mike, you're not feeling well, wake up, please. The man struggled but regained consciousness and began rubbing his face with his palms to quickly regain wakefulness. When he looked up at the doctor, he immediately realized something was wrong. His face was as white as chalk. The hand that had just awakened him was cold as ice and somehow lifeless. How is my wife? How is Alana? Is she feeling well? The first thing the businessman asked the doctor, and nurse quickly glanced at each other. The doctor then informed Mike, I'm sorry, Mike, we did everything we could for your spouse, but the bleeding was too much. Plus, the baby girl was very large. In coming out, she hit a vital artery in Alana's body. She didn't stand a chance. Again, my condolences. Mike felt his chin shake finally with horror then. Salty tears sprang from his eyes of their own accord. No, he whispered, and shook his head negatively. No, it can't be. She couldn't die, she couldn't. He said, "Take Mike to the spare room and sedate him." The doctor commanded the nurse. "We don't want him throwing a tantrum in here." The man himself did not remember how he had found himself in the ward, lying on the hard bed and staring at the ceiling at a single point next to the old chandelier. It was only now beginning to dawn on him that he had lost his Alana, the only woman he felt truly alive and happy with. They'd been married for almost 8 years. 8. He couldn't even believe it then. It seemed to him that they hadn't been married more than a week or two, and now she was gone. God, he roared like a wounded animal. For what? All that was left in his chest. All remnants of his soul seemed to have been scorched to the ground. The pain of loss was so intense that he felt it physically, right where his tortured heart was located. It wasn't until later that he remembered that he had a child. "A girl, my daughter? What's wrong with her?" Mike asked, silence surrounding him. Jumping out of bed, the man rushed to the doctor's office and asked the surgeon, who delivered his wife, the same question. "Calm down, please sit down." The doctor pointed him to a chair. When Mike reluctantly complied, the woman continued, "Your daughter is fine. She's in a postpartum pod right now. That's perfectly normal for her situation." The businessman looked at her as if his future depended on her words, considering her mother is dead. Subsequent nutrition for the baby will have to be done solely by artificial feeding. So I suggest you look into the matter as soon as possible. The doctor looked at Mike a little sternly, but when she saw that he was genuinely worried about the fate of his child and at the same time experiencing the tragic death of his wife, she softened considerably. "Look, I understand what you're going through, honestly, but you are not the first and, unfortunately, not the last man whose wife dies during childbirth. It happens, and there's nothing you can do about it." The doctor leaned closer to the businessman and continued, "The only thing you need to think about right now, the only thing you need to focus on as much as possible, is your little girl in the newborn box. So be a role model for her. Be strong, confident in your own success. Believe me, children read all this no worse than adults. In addition, it will help you get closer, which for a child who lost his mother in the first few hours of life is incredibly important." Mike nodded slowly then and swallowed with difficulty the huge acidic lump in his throat. If all of what the doctor was saying was true, then he would be the best father in the world to his daughter. When he was allowed to pick up his daughter, Mike almost cried when he saw the tiny baby girl in the pink warm envelope. That same day, he gave the girl the name Darla, which in translation from Greek means winner. For the next 17 years, the businessman did everything possible for his daughter so that she never for a minute did not stop feeling his love and support. Although at first it was very difficult for the single father, but he still managed to survive this difficult period. Despite being constantly busy, Mike still tried to be there for his child whenever possible. Darla never spent a single birthday or New Year's Eve alone or surrounded by only babysitters and daycare children. So when a daughter at the age of 4 became seriously interested in rhythmic gymnastics, the father only marveled at the willpower and stamina of his nondescript Darla. The girl's grandfather, John, in the early years of great help to his son-in-law, took the little girl to the section and later into competitions. Darla adored her grandfather and considered him her second best friend on earth after her father. Unfortunately, John was already quite old at that time and, like his late wife, had heart problems. When the granddaughter turned 9 years old, her grandfather passed away. The cause of the man's death was a massive stroke, which immediately gave a fatal complication to his heart. Darla cried very long and hard at the time. She could not imagine life without her beloved grandfather. So Mike was forced to take an unscheduled vacation at his firm for an indefinite period of time. For the next 2 weeks, he never left his daughter's side, constantly improving and distracting her until the little child's grief gradually subsided. In time, Darla returned to her usual routine and constant training, and this was the salvation that helped her to finally calm down and become stronger and more solid in spirit. "I will dedicate every victory I win to my grandfather," Darla promised her father. "I believe both he and Mom and Grandma are all watching over me from heaven and would really like to see me succeed in sports." "Of course, dear," the businessman smiled fondly, stroking his daughter through her soft, light brown hair. "You know, you're an incredibly wise girl. I'm really glad you were able to let go of Grandpa and continue to enjoy life." "I love you, Daddy." Shortly, Darla answered him and hugged her father tightly around the neck. "Mike, are you okay? Can you hear me?" announced the businessman and his driver when they were already approaching the office, thus bringing the man out of his reverie. "Why?" "Yes, of course, Nicholas. You were saying something. I couldn't get back to reality right away." Nicholas's driver looked at him carefully in the rearview mirror but said nothing. He had often noticed how his boss was immersed in his thoughts while on the road, and so he was used to it by now. "Yes, I'm telling you. Human Resources just called and said they were able to find you a new receptionist," Nicholas said, and at the same time carefully parked the owner's car. "They want you to take a look at her. They say she's a very competent lady. She knows what she's doing. She even seemed to have worked for your competitors some time ago, but left them because she wasn't satisfied with her salary." "Oh yeah," Mike chuckled. "All right, well, let's see who this lady is. I hope she at least knows how to make good coffee." A quarter of an hour later, he was already receiving in his office a tall, long-legged beauty of about 30 years old, giving him her graceful thin hand. As a sign of welcome, the woman introduced herself as Vivi and told the businessman about her extensive experience in secretarial work. So the company director noted to himself with satisfaction that the recruiters had not lied to him. This sultry brunette with plump lips and a thin waist really held her dignity and could present herself as if she were a real professional, and her gorgeous appearance was just the cherry on the cake, fitting the requirements of a reputable company like they were. "I think we're working with you, Vivi. Congratulations, you've been hired by us. Of course, you will have to go through a probationary period first, but I don't think you should have a problem with that." Vivi gave him a charming, special smile, then flicked a strand of her dark, bitter coffee-colored hair over her shoulder in elegant motion. "Thank you, Mike. I'm sure I'll enjoy working for your company, too. I can just feel the positive energy hanging around here." The woman lifted herself easily from the chair, and at that moment, the businessman saw a small, but rather racy part of her tanned cleavage. Vivi smiled again, while Mike involuntarily threw himself into a fever, and for a few moments, he even found it difficult to breathe. Since the death of his beloved wife, Alana, the businessman never remarried. Moreover, he hadn't been able to find a worthy companion with whom he could spend his time carefree, and who could open his soul as easily as he had with his wife. Oh, and he was just as worried about Darla. How would the girl feel about having another woman in his life? Would she get along with a hypothetical stepmother, or would the relationship between them be in constant tension? All these fears tormented Mike and did not give him the opportunity to really relax in the company of a nice woman. Later, he gave up these thoughts, referring to his age and constant business busyness. "Mole, who will marry me so busy?" And here before him stood this stunning Vivi, whose smile could drive any sensible man crazy at the snap of a finger. The businessman's heart beat faster as he imagined that he could marry such a beautiful person. However, Mike hurriedly put such thoughts out of his mind. He did not want to become a bad illustration of the famous joke about the boss and his faithful secretary mistress. Gathering all his self-control in a fist, Mike politely said goodbye to the young woman, and she sent him a promising smile in return, then quietly replied, "I'll look forward to my first day on the job." "Good day, Mike," she said, and as gracefully as she had entered, she slipped through the open door of his office. The businessman leaned back in his chair with relief and took a few deep breaths and exhaled. Such a turnaround he certainly hadn't expected even from himself. Could it be that for the first time in all these years, a real hot feeling flared up in his soul, that this was the very fall of love, which so many famous poets had sung in their verses so many times? Be that as it may, we must first take a closer look at this Vivi. Mike thought to himself, "It's not worth it at my age to jump into the deep end. We should wait a while." Having decided everything for himself, the man returned to work with difficulty and spent the rest of the day filling out another final report. However, no matter how hard he tried, he could not get out of his mind the beautiful secretary with whom he now had to work side by side. "What an old fool," Mike scolded himself. "God forbid you should fall in love in your old age. What are you going to do with all these feelings?" The man shook his head and reproached himself for his heartlessness. At the same time, Vivi, with a satisfied smile on her face, was leaving the building and getting into a cab at the cab driver's call. The woman leaned against the car window and thought happily to herself, "Got it? You got me hooked? My good man. Now I'll get it all out of you. It's a sin to miss such a big fish. It's time for me to get my rightful piece of happiness with a millionaire. I'm just going to finish this one thing first, and then I'll get right on you, Mike." "Turn it up," she asked the driver, and he turned the radio knob. The salon was filled with some pop tune in which the singer was happily bragging to the listeners about her wealth and happiness, which consisted in private planes, diamonds, and rich idiots. In fact, Vivi was not too fond of music, but this song reflected her gambling moods right now. A couple weeks afterward, Mike's life was abruptly divided into before and after. The businessman dropped his daughter off at practice as usual and went to the office himself. Darla, being a recent graduate, decided to finally connect her life with rhythmic gymnastics. That's why she wanted to first perform at regional competitions and then start preparing to enter the Institute of Physical Education. Nothing that day did not foreshadow the terrible disaster, which in the very near future was to break into Mike's life. Like an eerie storm, he was working in his office as usual when suddenly his cell phone rang, screen up to his face. The man was surprised to see that it was his daughter calling. Strange, the businessman thought to himself. Darla never calls during practice, and that something was up. Feeling a slight uneasiness in his soul, Mike answered the phone. "Hello," he said cautiously. "Hello? Hello, Mike?" An unfamiliar female voice asked him. "Yes," the man replied in a shaky voice. "And why are you calling from my daughter's cell phone? Who are you?" There was a second pause on the other end of the line, and then the same voice spoke. "My name is Tina. I'm your daughter Darla's coach. Your little girl just fainted right during practice. I don't know what happened to her, but an ambulance is taking her away right now. You better come to the hospital." I dictated the address. Mike felt the ground go out from under his feet, everything going dramatically dark in his eyes, barely able to keep from passing out himself. He wrote down the address of the hospital, and after drinking a large glass of water with a sedative tablet, he drove. When he explained at the emergency room who he was and who he had come to see, he was immediately taken to the doctor who had been dealing with Darla's condition since being admitted to them. As he looked at the doctor, the businessman noted with annoyance that the expression on his face was very worried. "Explain to me what's wrong with my Darla," Mike asked him as they entered his office. The doctor hesitated, a little unsure how to begin. Then he asked with a sigh, "Tell me, have you ever noticed any suspicious symptoms in your daughter? Sudden bruises, weakness, elevated body temperature for no particular reason?" The businessman shook his head confusedly. "No, never. I have a daughter who's an athlete. Of course she often gets bruises. But none of the things you just mentioned anyway. Darla has never complained about anything. You see, I work a lot, though I try to be home more often, but it's not always possible." The doctor twirled the pen in his hands thoughtfully before answering. "I see. In that case, I have some bad news for you." Mike tensed, all tense, unable to even contemplate what the doctor was going to tell him. "For God, what's wrong with my daughter?" he asked quietly. "It's suspected that Daria has acute leukemia. An examination has shown that she has monstrously excessive levels of certain enzymes responsible for blood clotting. Unfortunately, such a disease can appear in a person at almost any age. And teenagers who are actively engaged in physical activity are, alas, also at risk." Blake lowered his eyes, unable to look at the doctor. It had not yet fully dawned on him that his daughter was in mortal danger. Glancing down at his lap, the businessman was surprised to note how his hands were shaking with a fine tremor. It seemed to the man that he was in some terrible nightmare dream from which there was only one single way out to wake up. "Tell me, is there anything I can do to help her?" the businessman asked the doctor in a drooping voice. His own voice seemed as if it were a stranger to him, as if he saw and heard himself from the outside, as if in a movie. The doctor looked at him carefully and answered with a sigh. "Yes, but we don't have much time. We'll still do further examination. So for now, the girl will remain under our care. You can have your blood tested. If you get a complete match, then we can perform a bone marrow transplant from you to your daughter. It's the only way to completely beat the disease." A tiny light of hope flashed in the businessman's eyes at the doctor's words. "Of course, doctor, I'm willing to do anything, even give up my whole self for parts, just to make my little girl well." "Good," he nodded. "Come along then. You need to be prepped." Mike stopped the doctor here, touching his arm lightly. "Excuse me, but can I see Darla? I need to talk to my daughter, explain things to her. I mean, she must be in such a state of terror right now." The doctor's voice sounded soft as he replied, "Don't worry. She already knows everything. Your girl is a real fighter. She took the news so calmly." The doctor looked at the businessman with slight envy. "You know, if I had a daughter like that, I would be incredibly proud of her. Such resilience and will." Mike nodded absent-mindedly. "Yes, I have her like that. You're not the first person to say those words to me." A few hours later, when all the necessary tests had been run, the doctor left the office, looking glumly at the results. From the look on his face, the businessman realized that the doctor was very unhappy about something. "Doctor, how can I be a donor for Darla?" The doctor slowly tore his gaze away from the papers. His eyes were full of regret and sadness. "To my great regret, Mike, you are not a match." The world at that moment instantly lost all of its colors in the businessman's eyes. Mike felt his hands sharply pricked, and therefore slowly sat down on the edge of the chair standing in the hall. Why? He could only ask. "It happens often," the doctor answered as calmly as possible. "Don't get upset before the time. You just need a closer relative with similar genetic material. Tell me, does your daughter have any siblings? Maybe the girl's mother could try donating her blood too." The depressed millionaire could hardly answer. "Her mother died years ago in childbirth. I am the only one she has left. Darla has no brothers or sisters." The doctor pressed his lips together and took a seat next to the businessman. "Then you have only one option left: to urgently find a donor. I will, of course, send a request through my channels, but the chance of finding one so quickly is slim. Try to find any other relatives of Darla's, preferably on her mother's side. Even the most distant relative might happen to have a phenotype that matches ours." Mike listened to the doctor while his head was a complete fog. Finally, turning to the doctor, he looked at him with eyes full of mute pleading. "Can I still see Darla? Please." "Sure. Let's go." The doctor responded instantly and led the man to the private room where his daughter had been transferred at Mike's request after her initial examination and all the necessary care. "Daddy," Darla exclaimed, and her father rushed to her, clutching his daughter tightly in his arms. "Darla, honey, how are you?" he asked the businessman. Tears were already glistening in his eyes. Darla looked very pale, but she was still holding up well. When she spoke, her voice sounded almost cheerful. Normal, considering what happened to me. "Dad, how is this possible? Why did this disease—" There was no fear in Darla's eyes, yet a huge question shone in them. And also a sense of injustice. "What about my competitions, my training?" The girl tried to talk about the most everyday things, obviously trying to push away the worst thoughts that way. Mike smiled at his daughter through her tears and stroked her face as gently as if she were made of crystal. "I'm afraid we'll have to say goodbye to that for a while," he said slowly. "The most important thing now is your health." After a moment's silence, the businessman decided to be honest with his daughter. "Darla, unfortunately, I won't be able to be your donor. My blood is not suitable for you, but I will definitely solve this issue. I'll find a donor, I promise you." Upon learning that her last hope had dissipated like smoke, Darla couldn't hold back her own tears. "How many dads?" "What? How many dads?" He didn't understand. "How much do the doctors give me?" The man sighed heavily, and because of that sigh, the girl realized that she didn't have long to live. "I see," Darla slowly muttered. "It turns out that this may be our last meeting." The girl looked at this so piercingly that the businessman's heart clenched. "No, of course not," Mike tried to reassure her. "I'll be sure to come to you again. I'll just try to find someone whose blood is exactly right for you first. I'll save you, daughter, I swear." Darla slowly stroked her father's cheek, saying, "Promise me you won't give up, even if I'm not in your life. You absolutely must live and remember me. Then I will be at peace up there." The girl raised her eyes to the ceiling, referring to the sky where her mother, grandfather, and grandmother resided. "Don't tell me such things," exclaimed Mike in despair. "You will live. Do you hear me? You're going to live." Mike began to cover Darla's hand with kisses, then assured her that he would come visit her in a few days. His daughter gave her father a final kiss on the cheek, after which the businessman handed her over to the doctors and left the hospital as if he had just been run over by a train. Only a month was left for his daughter, because the disease came upon her with terrible force. The doctor said the leukemia outbreak could have been triggered by extreme stress on the eve of the competition. For the first time in his life, Mike regretted giving his daughter to rhythmic gymnastics. From helplessness, the man sank down on the cold stone steps that led to the medical center and, in despair, wrapped his arms around his head. What should he do now? Where to get that damn donor when Alana's entire family had been dead for a long time, and he had never even heard of another relative? At that moment, he saw a woman stop in front of him. Or rather, he didn't even see all of her, just her feet shod in summer-open sandals. A long skirt of light material was building around her legs, and Mike slowly raised his worry-weary face to her. "Who are you?" he asked, looking up at the street fortune teller smiling at him as she strolled leisurely through the city streets at this hour. "I, Hannah," the fortune teller replied solemnly and held out her hand to him. I see you need help, dear. Let me give you a fortune telling on your hand. Don't be afraid, I won't take any money from you. I see when people are genuinely worried about their troubles, and when they are asking for a fortune telling for fun. The most interesting thing was that this Hannah did not look at all like some gypsy from a traveling Tabor. She was a decently dressed young woman of about 25 or 27 with long blonde hair in a high ponytail and a light blue denim jacket thrown carelessly over her white, aristocratic shoulders. The blue eyes looked at Mike with such genuine sympathy and warmth that he didn't have the heart to turn her away. "I don't think you can help me," the businessman replied tiredly. "I don't think anyone will be able to find the answer to the question that now occupies me more than anything else in the world." The fortune teller's eyebrows rose in amazement. "You don't believe in the power of my gift? Or do you think that because I don't look like a gypsy, I'm of no use to you? I have an Irish gypsy grandmother, by the way." Mike looked at the girl curiously. "That's the first I've ever heard of such a thing," he said, and rose slowly to his feet. "Well, Hannah, if you're so sure, then please." The man held out his hand to the fortune teller and she instantly took it, scrutinizing the tiny lines on his palm and fingers. All the while Hannah was twirling his hand back and forth. And at the same time she kept muttering affirmatively, as if she had already figured it all out and was only looking for the latest confirmation of her amazing discovery. "It's clear." Finally, she looked at the rich man with genuine concern. "Do you have someone on your bloodline sick? A very close daughter or sister? I think it's the daughter after all. You want to help her, but you don't know how fate says you need to find another. Then you can save her." Mike, who had been standing there all this time listening to the fortune tellers with undisguised amazement, suddenly frowned sharply. How is that finding another? What does it all mean?" Hannah took another quick glance at his palm and nodded affirmatively. "That's right. There can be no doubt. The prophecy says so." Mike pulled his palms from her hands, muttered disappointedly. "What kind of nonsense is this? I almost fell for it." "Jesus." Hannah, realizing the businessman didn't believe her, only shrugged. "It's up to you. I told you the whole truth as it is. This is the salvation for your daughter. If you let it go to waste, you won't remember me in a bad word because I warned you." With those words, Hannah strode dutifully away toward the park, leaving the anxious and shocked rich man alone with his thoughts. Find another. What on earth could that possibly mean? Meanwhile, the businessman puzzled. Although he did not believe in the predictions of this strange blonde, but his gut felt that there was something useful in this phrase, something that would help him find a way out of his dire situation with Darla. Hannah was on her way home when she witnessed a horrifying scene. Walking across the bridge, the fortune teller saw a young girl of about 17, 18 years old climbing over the railing. The intentions were more than easy to guess. Hannah rushed to her and only by a miracle managed to grab the unfortunate girl by the shoulder, pulling her down with force. "Are you out of your mind?" She shouted at the girl when she was already sitting on the pavement, holding on to the railing. "Have you had enough of life or what? What if I am?" The unfortunate girl shouted back at her, and large tears came to her eyes. "If I simply have nothing and nowhere else to live, what do you want me to do and collect alms?" Having breathed a little, the street fortune teller knelt down on her knees beside the girl. "Look, I understand you're going through something. Apparently something really bad. Just decided to jump off the bridge into the river. But only the most horrible and unfair thing in the world shouldn't push you to do something so stupid, you know? Life is the most important. God is the most precious thing we have. Can't you just try to walk away from it like that?" The young stranger looked at the fortune teller, and her face reflected hopelessness and anguish. "Tricked," she tried to explain. "So deceived that now I don't know how to go on living or what to do at all." Hannah looked at her doubtfully. "What about the boyfriend?" "No way," the stranger said. She tried to rise to her feet, but she was still a little shaky from the shock she had suffered. "My aunt. She robbed near my apartment by fraud and changed the locks. I didn't even have time to get my things before she threw me out of there like a kitten." The girl covered her face with her hands and wept bitterly. She especially felt sorry for the young, stupid one who was ready to give up her life because of some miserable square meters. Then the fortune teller suggested to her, "You know what? Let's go to my place now. I'll give you hot tea and we'll eat something at the same time, and you tell me everything in detail, who and how you cheated. I may be able to help you in some way." The girl looked at her with red, tear-stained eyes and nodded gratefully. "Thank you. And please forgive me, I didn't mean to scare anyone. It's just the way I am, out of desperation. Don't worry, I'm not vindictive." The fortune teller smirked and extended her hand for an introduction. "My name's Hannah. What's yours?" Leslie nodded, and the girl replied, "What a beautiful name you have. It's something European or Greek," the fortune teller explained. "It's just rare now. My grandmother chose it for me. She kept hoping I'd make fewer mistakes in my life than my mother did." The young woman explained to Leslie that the name Hannah translates from ancient Greek as pure, and the fortune teller's mother was characterized by excessive love and mobility, for which she eventually paid the price. Her grandmother said she was sent to the other world by one of the ancient fans, Hannah said, in between, while they put the kettle on and put the flavored shortbread cookies in a saucer. By this time, they had arrived at the fortune teller's small apartment. What a horror. Leslie flung up her hands. "How on earth did you survive that?" The woman only shrugged and threw her jacket on the old plush couch. "I don't know. I was only 5 at the time. That's how my grandmother raised me. She used to take care of me all the time before that, while my mother was getting her own life together. And when all this happened, she took me away from the Tabor and moved here, to the city. We've lived together ever since. She taught me her skills, and I was the best domestic helper for her. It's just a pity she didn't live to see my high school graduation. My grandmother made me such a dress that all my classmates were green with envy the whole evening. Losing a mom is the biggest tragedy in a person's life," Leslie said wistfully. Then she added, "I lost mine recently too. Just 4 months ago." "I'm sorry." The fortune teller lowered her eyes. "What happened?" "I'm sorry if I'm prying. You promised me you'd tell me what happened to you. Remember?" Leslie looked sadly at her new acquaintance. "The accident. Mom was coming home from work and crossing the road at a green traffic light. At that moment, some car just oversteered. The police said it had a brake failure or something. Anyway, Mom was gone, hit by a car." Hannah looked at her sympathetically, and then she showed up. "That's her sister, my aunt," the girl continued. "I was just out of high school and wanted to go to the institute to study history. It all came upon me so suddenly and terribly, on my mom's death, not knowing what to do next." Leslie sighed heavily before continuing. "She showed up at the funeral for the first time. She was all beautiful and caring. She helped me with the wake. But then when all the guests left and it was like she'd been replaced, cold, calculating bitch. That's what she turned out to be." "Yes. You and your aunt have a strained relationship," Hannah said, startled. "That's an understatement," Leslie said, angrily, wiping away tears with her fist. "I mean, she only wanted her mom's apartment. That's all. She complained to me that I was the only one living in such a huge 2-bedroom, and she had to go to rented apartments. Since she's a sister, she's also entitled to a part of Mom's property. I tried to explain to her that there was no mention of her in the will. However, this woman was just incredibly stuck." The fortune teller listened without interrupting, giving the girl a chance to speak. "In the end," Leslie continued, "my aunt suggested we split the apartment so that neither of us would be offended. I was a little upset, of course, but then I felt sorry. She and my mom really haven't had a good relationship all their lives. I don't know what caused it, but it must have been something serious. It's unlikely they'd have quarreled over some nonsense." Leslie took a big sip of tea and finished her unfunny story. "Anyway, I agreed to the exchange, but she brought in her lawyer, and I couldn't even read what I was signing. It's my own fault, of course. I probably should have insisted that I was given time to familiarize myself with the documents. But in fact, it turned out that there was no exchange. And I signed her, this aunt, a deed of gift for my mom's apartment." Here, the girl again could not contain her feelings and cried literally to tears. "What a fool I am." The girl scolded herself. "How could I believe her?" "Well, you didn't know that she would want to do such a mean thing to you," the fortune teller tried to comfort her. "It's always the last thing you expect from the people closest to you." But Leslie only shook her head negatively. "I should have sensed, should have guessed that since she was acting so strangely and persistently, she was definitely up to something wrong. But I fell for it like a stupid chicken." The girl said that when she returned from the preparatory course for the institute the next day, she could not get to her house. The girl pounded on the door for a long time, until the aunt opened the door and announced that the apartment now belonged to her, and hers she had just cleverly contrived. "Can you imagine my feelings?" she asked the fortune teller. "She told me that she had changed the locks, and now there was nothing in this house that belonged to me. And when I asked her, where do I go now, knowing what she told me, Hannah looked at the girl curiously. Said I could try to get into the institute the first time and go straight into full-time study, on a budget. Then they say I will be assigned a room in the dormitory and will have a place to live. The young fortune teller was amazed at the cynicism of this horrible woman and patted her shoulder. "Okay, don't worry, so we'll think of something. Until then, you can live at my place as long as you want. Girl, you're a good one. I can see you're not lying about your aunt and your situation. Any of us could be in that situation. If you only knew what I sometimes see when I'm walking around the city and reading people's hands or cards." And Hannah shook her head meaningfully. A tiny flicker of hope appeared in Leslie's eyes at that moment. "Thank you so much," she thanked the fortune teller fervently. "I'll definitely get a job. You'll see. I'll help you clean, I'll help you cook if you want." In response, Hannah advised the girl not to worry and promised her that she would definitely think of a way to teach her aunt a lesson and get Leslie her rightful apartment back. For the next couple of weeks, Leslie lived in Hannah's tiny apartment and helped her around the house. While the young fortune teller earned a living for herself and her entertaining passers-by in the park at the weekend fair, as well as doing personalized card readings and making individual astrological forecasts and horoscopes, for which, as Hannah assured her, she was always paid the most money. Leslie also wasted no time and went all sorts of interviews, all the same. After all this shocking story with her aunt in the apartment, she could not properly prepare for the entrance exams. That's why she decided to try to find some kind of job, not to hang on Hannah's neck, and at the same time to get the experience she needed, without which she was not wanted to be hired by the less decent companies. In the meantime, Mike was trying to hold on with his life. He was constantly looking for a suitable donor for his daughter, but so far everything was to no avail. As before, the businessman visited Darla in the hospital, but each time he became more and more convinced that she had only a little time left. Despite the coordinated, competent actions of doctors, as well as the necessary drugs in such a situation, the girls still needed an urgent operation. Everyone, including Darla, understood this perfectly well and did not give up hope of finding her donor at last. Remembering the fortune teller's strange prediction, Mike could not figure out its basic essence. However, he still listened to the words of Hannah, the bloodline, and hired the best detectives in town to try to track down any of his late wife's distant relatives. "You need to calm down, Mike," Vivi said affectionately, walking around him and handing the man a cup of coffee with dark bitter chocolate on a platter, the businessman's favorite treat that helped him relieve a lot of stress. "I'm sure sooner or later you'll reach your goal and Darla will recover." At the same time, the secretary looked at her boss with such a languid gaze that he had to look away. And he, of course, still liked this gorgeous woman very much, and she didn't seem to mind trying to take their relationship to the next level. Except that Mike wasn't really interested in that right now. His first priority, as he'd always said, was his daughter. Seeing that she couldn't win the millionaire over, Vivi was only breaking her fingernails under the table, giving him the friendliest smile she could muster. Damn that Darla of his, the woman was tearing in metal in her thoughts. She should have gotten sick right now, when he and I were just starting to have something to stick. Couldn't wait a year for me and her daddy to get married in there. She could have switched her own. No one's stopping me. I'd get his whole fortune if I did. I'd find a way to make good use of my money. He had such devious plan. Vivi continued to work at Mike's company while trying to conquer this impregnable fortress. On a future day, when Mike was scrutinizing the terms of the upcoming deal, his phone suddenly burst with a melodious sound. When the man picked up, it turned out to be one of the detectives he'd sent to track down Alana's relatives calling him. "So, any news?" the businessman asked hopefully. "Yes and no," the detective answered him evasively. "You see, the thing is, it turns out Alana doesn't have any relatives of any kind anymore." Mike's heart immediately dropped somewhere down into the darkest abyss. "Are you sure?" "Maybe you didn't look hard enough." After all, her family was considered quite famous in its day. No second cousin, siblings, or brothers, and a deep sigh was heard at the other end of the phone. "Believe me, Mike, we've pored over every archive in the town and village where your spouse was born, and there's absolutely nothing. However, as I said, we did manage to find something interesting." The businessman immediately concentrated to the best of his ability on the detective's voice. "And what was that?" "When we checked the archives of the hospital where your wife gave birth, we found one interesting detail." The detective began cautiously. "Tell me, Mike, were you aware that Alana had given birth to twins?" "What?" The businessman couldn't believe his ears. "Do you think you're saying that?" "Sam, what twins? My wife never cheated on me and was only pregnant with Darla." It slowly began to dawn on the rich man, and his hunch was confirmed by the detective himself. "That's why I'm asking, because it's about the same single birth," he said slowly. One of the 2 sample reports I found says that your wife gave birth to 2 twin girls. Mike rubbed his own forehead tensely in his office. He resolutely did not understand what was happening now. But the doctor didn't tell us anything like that, did he? I don't see how that's possible. Did you have an ultrasound? The detective asked. Yes, but can you imagine what it was like back then? The only device in the whole city, and it was malfunctioning every once in a while. Unless there was some mistake and the doctor who performed the ultrasound just didn't see the second child. But that still doesn't change the fact that I never knew anything about the second daughter. Where is she then? The detective was silent for a moment, obviously contemplating how best to say the next piece of news. That's where we come to the most interesting part. There was another woman in labor at the same time as your wife that day, the daughter of the same midwife who delivered Alana's baby. And, according to the documents, the midwife's granddaughter died then, suffocated, entangled in the umbilical cord. Jesus, Mike couldn't take it anymore. But what does this have to do with me? Most directly, I'm afraid. Mike, continued the detective. As I was saying, the main oddity was that there were originally 2 of each conclusion. That is, both your wife's and the midwife's daughters. And while in Alana's case, and it says she had one of her twins die at birth following the mother, the midwife's daughter's file is quite the opposite. Actually, they were my little girl, Mike finally realized. I'm afraid so, Sam replied sadly. We found both reports in the party section of the head doctor's drawer. Don't ask how we did it, we won't tell you anyway. Fact is, the midwife's daughter never found out anything. She thought she'd given birth to her baby. Soon after, they all moved together, the one daughter and their grandmother, to live somewhere up north. And that's where their traces are finally lost. So you don't know where my daughter is now? Mike asked him quietly. Unfortunately, that's all we've been able to find out, the detective replied. But still, you now know that there is another daughter of yours somewhere, if you're lucky enough to find her. How am I supposed to find her when I've been counting on you for this? Mike snapped at the detective. I don't have any more time. Darla doesn't have any more time. She's dying. It took the businessman a second to pull himself back together and apologize to the detective, thanking him for his work. Mike hung up the phone and slowly sank into his desk chair. Okay, so he had been duped in the most brazen way possible, only giving up 1 infant out of 2. This wife's card was completely fabricated, and it seems that even the midwife herself didn't know that Alana was going to have twins. When it all happened and his wife was gone, the midwife thought it would be no big deal if she gave her daughter one of the twins so that the young woman, God forbid, wouldn't go crazy with grief upon learning of her own baby girl's death. Mike felt absolutely devastated and broken, and his last hope had died before it could take shape. Right now, the businessman knew only one thing. If he lost Darla, he would lose all incentive for further life and work. His daughter was everything to him, and he certainly didn't want to live in a world where she was gone. 3 days later, Hannah brought Leslie a newspaper with free classifieds. Of course, grabbed on the way, in case you find something normal here. Suggested the fortune teller, seeing how desperately the girl was suffering without a job everywhere she went. During this time, everywhere she was offered to pass first some paid courses or even turned back, citing the lack of yesterday's schoolgirl any experience. Leslie got upset and wanted to try to take a loan from the bank to get at least some training with which she could be hired. When Hannah was able to convince her that all the loans and courses were nothing more than an elaborate hoax paid for by enthusiasts like Leslie herself, it's better to flip through the paper. She persuaded the girl, who had become her best friend in the meantime. Here always printed vacancies for ordinary people, and maybe something will appeal to you. The girl followed the fortune teller's advice and scrutinized the thin magazine. After an agonizing choice between a dishwasher and a cleaner, Leslie chose the latter, and rightly so. Hannah encouraged her. Of course, it's not the most prestigious profession, but the firm is very good, well known, and they promise a decent salary, so it's a good reason to try for an interview. Leslie agreed with a sigh. This was not the career she had dreamed of, but on the other hand, she had to start somewhere. 25. A 20 man arriving at the address, the girl found a large and bright office of the construction firm, inside which reigned cleanliness and beauty. However, having risen to the 5th floor to go to the director of the company, Leslie froze, exactly halted, unable to utter a word. The girl turned as pale as a canvas. Her only wish at that moment was to fall through the ground, but it was too late. Vivi had seen her and was now standing, blocking Leslie's path to the principal's office with her hands at her sides. "You," the secretary whispered. "What are you doing here, you little shit?" Leslie stared at her aunt point blank, never relinquishing her angry but proud gaze. "I'm here to apply for a job. Let me through," she said, and tried to get past Vivi. But she grabbed the girl roughly by the shoulders. "Are you applying for a job as a cleaner? And I'm sitting here wondering how you got here." The secretary's look at that moment was like that of a snake preparing for a fatal leap. "No, my dear, not today," shoved Leslie across the hall to Vivi. "There's nothing for you to do here. I don't want it to be accidentally revealed later that you're the one coming to see me, my dear. That would be a disgrace that would never be cleaned up." Vivi looked at the young girl with all the anger and hatred she could muster. Hearing strange shouting and fumbling outside the door, Mike decided to go out and see for himself what was going on. "Vivi, what's going on?" Whether or not the girl came in for her interview, I've already gotten calls from HR. They say they lost her. Vivi wanted to explain something to him, but saw the supervisor's face gray at the sight of her niece. "Mike, what's wrong with you?" The secretary asked cautiously, and the nasty smile instantly flew off her face. "You're my good girl," the businessman managed to say. The girl looked at him with incomprehensible eyes. She transferred her neighbor's gaze to him and back again. Vivi turned to her niece, and Leslie was ready to swear she saw a hellfire of rage in her eyes. "Get out of here." Vivi ordered her immediately. However, Mike extended his hand toward the girl and shook his head. "No, let her stay. Please, girl. I don't know your name. Give me a few minutes, I beg of you." Leslie didn't know what to do, but there was such desperation written on the man's face that the yesterday's schoolgirl agreed. "Okay," Leslie said simply, and followed Mike. He was in a state of complete shock. After all, in front of him stood an exact copy of his daughter. Could it be true? Was this girl really his lost daughter Darla's twin? If so, he was left with one last chance to save his child. "Please, let's do a DNA test," Mike pleaded with her in his office. "Listen, my daughter is about to die. The doctors have already done everything they can. If it turns out you and my girl are sisters, it could literally save a life." Leslie doubted that such a thing could really happen. But the story the businessman told her about himself and his daughter, and about the results of the investigation, still convinced the girl to try to trust him. After all, if it was true and Darla was her sister, then she would have another family. Having given her consent for the tests to be run, Leslie and Mike immediately drove to the hospital. When the girl's blood was drawn to run all the necessary tests, the man took her to his daughter's room. Darla, of course, was shocked no less than her father. However, she took Leslie's appearance very positively. She greeted the girl in a friendly manner and then told her, "There is no such coincidence in nature. You can see that you and I are alike as two drops of water. You must be my lost sister. Daddy told me everything." Leslie felt like she was in some kind of fantasy movie. There was no doubt in the girl's mind that she and Darla were alike, but she'd never felt like she had a sister or even a twin. And after all, twins are supposed to be able to sense such things even from a distance. "Congratulations. The test confirmed your parentage 100. The doctor announced to Mike and the girls with a happy smile. "If Leslie is ready, we can begin the process of preparing for surgery." It was all so sudden and rapid for the young girl. "Of course, let's get started." It was all she could manage to nod. The preparations went well, and soon Darla was transplanted with some bone marrow and transfused with her own sister's blood. After that, the girl recovered almost immediately, and Leslie, who was lying in the ward with her, still couldn't believe that she had found both a sister and a father at the same time. In the hustle and bustle of events, Leslie did not immediately remember that she wanted to talk to Mike. That evening, when she was feeling better, she asked to spend a few minutes with her father and warned him about Vivi. "Don't believe that woman, please," she said in a voice weak from the surgery. "She is far from being as nice and kind as she wants to appear." In general terms, the girl told her newfound father about the story of her apartment and the fact that she was now staying with Hannah the fortune teller. Hearing about the latter, Mike immediately remembered her find another prophecy. God, that's what that meant. She was talking about Darla's sister. He hadn't realized it right away. Upon learning of his secretary's deception, the businessman was furious at her behavior. The very next day, he fired the bastard and threatened her with jail if she didn't sign the apartment back over to Leslie. Vivi wanted to be rich and wanted to stay free even more, so she gave the apartment back to her niece and left town for good. Finally recovered, Leslie was happy to know that she could now return home. She was going to go to college, just like she wanted to, and promised her father to visit her and Darla whenever she could. The girls had no doubts that they would become friends, so businessman Mike was very happy for them. Hannah Mike invited to his workplace. In gratitude for the fact that she helped his lost daughter, he made the woman his personal astrologer, and the young woman was very happy that her prophecy, having come true, saved the life of an entire family. Gradually, the first timid feelings between her and Hannah were born. Their relationship from a working relationship smoothly turned into a romantic one. The man, having got to know Hannah better, realized that she could be a new breath of life for him and create for him that missing home comfort, which he so dreamed of. Soon, he and Hannah were married. The wedding was very beautiful and left the guests with many fond memories. Now they all live together in the millionaire's house and enjoy every day, which gives them the opportunity to enjoy life again and get to know each other from new sides. How Helen hated sad funeral ceremonies. Well, of course, no one asked her permission to live or go beyond the border, to a place from which no one could return. And now, as soon as she saw the inscription Julia, neighbor on the smartphone screen, her heart sank with an unpleasant feeling. Helen, hello baby, it's Aunt Julia who worries. Sorry to bring you bad news this morning, but your father's phone isn't answering, so I have to bring grief down on you. George died. I was going to work and saw him sitting in an apple tree. I look, he seems to be doing something, half turning towards the street. Well, I wave to him and say, good morning. I ask what he was doing early in the morning, and George showed zero emotion to me, didn't even move. Although you know that my voice is loud, it's impossible not to hear. I went up to George, but he wasn't breathing. While I'm sitting here on the porch, I called all the necessary services, except for the ritual. It's not for me to decide how to see off George, but to be honest, I need to go to work. Would you come? Testedly responded in a hoarse voice. Of course, Aunt Julia, I'm leaving now. I'll be there in 30 minutes. The sad news that her paternal grandfather, the always cheerful and cheerful George, had overcome the last milestone came as a real shock to Helen. We have to go, of course, organize everything, call everyone from grandfather's phone book. However, I wanted to convince myself that this conversation with my neighbor about my grandfather was just a bad dream. Now all you need to do is open your eyelids wide and look at the call history on your smartphone and make sure that there was no call. Unfortunately, this hope was not justified, and there really was a call from Aunt Valia. And the girl did everything possible to quickly get to her grandfather's house, located within the city, but in the so-called private sector. Having already got into the taxi car that had arrived on call, Helen asked her boss for a day off, then had a short conversation with her office colleague, explaining where the documents were, which, as luck would have it, the customers were supposed to come for today. The girl never dared to make the most difficult call. How to inform your father and mother, who have flown away on vacation to celebrate their 25th wedding anniversary, that they urgently need to return to say goodbye to grandfather George. Helen became sad. How unexpectedly this tragedy happened. Just the day before yesterday, she called her grandfather. He said that he was waiting for a visit and asked him to come quickly. Not for the sake of caring for a small garden, but to talk on some issue, to seek it. Helen promised to be there on the weekend that had recently flown by. She could have easily visited her grandfather, but she got a little sick, postponed the visit, called and apologized. They chatted for a bit about nothing. Grandfather George recalled the method that his wife Kristen and grandmother Helen always used. The girl listened that she needed to brew special herbs, wait until the infusion cooled to a pleasant warmth, stir a spoonful of honey in a glass of healing liquid, drink it, and lie down under the blanket. She promised that she would undergo intensive treatment and then visit him. And in the first month of autumn, when she had a vacation scheduled, the girl promised to stay with him for at least a week. Lord, how embarrassing. Now Helen was ashamed that she was going to wait for her vacation. After all, by public transport with transfers, you could get to grandfather in 45 minutes. When there were no traffic jams on the roads, you could even after work go not home, but to a loved one who had been incredibly bored alone for a little over a year. Moreover, it was uneasy that she was a free girl and could easily keep a lonely grandfather company. It would be quite possible to go to work and back by taxi. Of course, it would be more expensive than using public transport, but it would be quick and comfortable. Alternatively, you could simply leave the house a little earlier in order to walk to the transport stop from which the tram of the required route departs. Everything could absolutely be resolved, sorted out somehow. But he didn't have the insight to understand that Grandpa George needed care and supervision, and his requests to come were not just the whim of a bored elderly man. Helen was tormented by a painful feeling of shame, and sighing, she tried to call her parents. However, both Mom and Dad's numbers were out of network coverage. The girl had to send a letter by email, hoping that the unpleasant news would be read not too late. While solving troubles and questions, the time on the way to my grandfather's house flew by unnoticed. Helen got out of the taxi and, listening to Aunt Valia's sympathetic remarks, felt real grief falling on her. The neighbor hugged the girl who arrived, asked her to hold on, and ran to work. Helen looked at her grandfather and kept expecting that now he would get up, stretch, and invite her to a tea party in the house or in the gazebo entwined with grapes. However, no miracle happened. Her services, which arrived in response to a call from a neighbor, began another whirlwind of sad affairs associated with the passing of the older generation. The lady doctor confirmed the death of my grandfather, presumably from a heart attack. She recommended funeral agencies to the girl and explained that there were specialists working there who could organize mourning procedures with the most due respect for the deceased and sympathy for his relatives. Helen listened to the advice and tried with all her might to hold back bitter tears of despair. Only by lunchtime the girl was left alone. Helen entered her grandfather's house and burst into tears when she saw the phone on the table, which he apparently forgot on his last earthly morning. Probably if he had a cell phone, he would be able to call somewhere and ask for help, but it was impossible to change the past. Everything turned out the way it did. The girl discovered the cash, which her grandfather George and grandmother Kristen told her about shortly after she came of age. The man then tilted the rug hanging over the bed, gently pressed on one of the wooden panels, then with a slight movement moved it to the side. The surprised girl saw a deep vertical niche. Grandfather explained, "Here, granddaughter, Spetta and I are slowly putting money here so that it won't be a burden to anyone. You'll bury us with this money." Helen remembered how she began to grumble at her grandparents. She said that it was too early for them to think about such a topic. She assured that they would still have the opportunity to babysit their great-grandchildren. "No, my dear, that won't do. First, I will have to consider approve, and then help raise the kids. Mom and Dad always have no time." Granny, patting her smiling granddaughter on the head, quietly objected. "Helen, we're not asking you whether it's too early for us to think about our last journey in this world or not. Just showing you so you know, just in case. After all, George already has an anniversary this year, 70 years old, and I'm not much younger. Alas, at that age anything can happen. Your parents, of course, also know about this hiding place. But you never know, maybe they'll be wary or start being modest." Grandfather George supported his wife. "Now, we don't want to be a burden to you. So let's end the conversation." The grandmother hastened to change the topic and began to talk about the amusements of the selected kitten, simply nicknamed the man. Now, 6 years after this conversation, the skinny kid has turned into a well-fed, long, and independent, handsome man. The owner's departure was a real shock for the animal, and he even lost his excellent appetite for several days. However, Grandfather George managed to pull the cat out of this state, and now this mission fell to Helen. It seemed to the girl that the orphan cat understood everything, and that's why he curled up on his grandfather's bed and didn't even react to the sound of the refrigerator door opening. The agencies recommended by our employee were indeed professional. A serious man suggested that Helen hold a farewell not at home, but in a special ritual hall at the cemetery. Getting there is much easier than here in the private sector, and even though the house is big, there will still be fuss, unnecessary fuss. The room there is convenient and comfortable. Everyone will be able to say goodbye calmly and without the crush that usually accompanies the removal of a body from an apartment or house. Everything will be both touching and civilized. Besides, understand, it will save you a lot of problems. The offer seemed reasonable to Helen, but she had to spend not only her meager savings but also her grandfather's stash to pay for funeral services. The girl did everything that was necessary. As if being in a state of sleep, she kept waiting for her parents to arrive, or at least answer the email, but in vain. The girl contacted the hotel where they had booked a room, but as we managed to understand from the answer in broken Russian, Mr. and Mrs. Hurd did not move in. They explained that they had decided to change plans a little. Helen was worried about her parents, but she couldn't do anything. Now clods of earth began to fall on the lid of Grandfather George's coffin, but neither his son nor his daughter-in-law appeared. Words of condolences and sympathy were received by Helen, who had to listen to the lamentations of distant relatives who came to see the old man off on his last journey. Some spoke bluntly about the thoughtless son and daughter-in-law who did not appear at the mournful event. The girl defended her parents as best she could, and the guardians of other people's morality fell silent for a while, turning the conversation to other topics. Gradually, only relatives and closest neighbors remained at the funeral table, organized in a small cafe. Helen, who last saw most of them a little less than a year ago at farewell to grandmother Sveta, could hardly endure all the questions. She wanted to run away from the cafe as soon as possible, but she had to fulfill her granddaughter's duty to the very end. From time to time, she herself, along with the waiters, took out dirty dishes and brought funeral treats, just so as not to sit at the table listening to the conversations of those gathered growing louder. Quite by chance, Helen, while serving another portion of pies, overheard part of the conversation between Aunt Valia and grandfather's cousin Stepan. George sometimes communicated with this apple tree like a person. I told him, even when Kristen was alive, that this useless tree needs to be cut down. It has long grown higher than the roof of the house, and apples cannot be easily obtained. Kristen, Kingdom of Heaven. She kept swearing that this tree was of little use. It would bear fruit for a year so that you were tired of growing the harvest. Then it wouldn't bear a single fruit. Everything was threatened to be cut down. Only George, blessed to his memory, always stood up to defend the apple tree, nodding, and Julia agreed with the interlocutor. What you say is true. George's passion for this old apple tree also seemed strange to me. Well, if only the plot was about a hectare, then it would seem that the place wouldn't be a problem. But it's simply stupid to leave such a huge tree in such a small snippet of conversation, made Helen think. Indeed, in fact, grandfather treated this apple tree as if it were a living person. The girl often saw him affectionately stroking the bark of a tree as he passed by. Once as a child, Helen, deciding to play, climbed onto a branch, which broke off under her. And grandfather George, entrusting his granddaughter to the care of his wife, began to treat the wound of the tree himself, recently. After the death of grandmother Kristen, my grandfather even preferred to relax alone under the crown of an apple tree, rather than in a specially built gazebo entwined with grapes. Thoughts from the mysterious apple tree that George had so highlighted briefly receded to sad worries. The relatives were the last to leave the rented hall, and Stepan reminded Helen, no, someone should definitely spend the night in George's house until 40. You won't be scared alone until your parents show up. Maybe send someone with you. At least take Mylena, my youngest daughter, with you. She has nothing to do at home anyway. Her husband is on a business trip. You can sit and chat. Looking at her, she saw the face of a woman who clearly had her own plans for the evening and completely lacked the desire to spend the night somewhere in an unfamiliar place. Helen hastened to refuse. But thank you, but I really can handle it myself. After all, it's like a sign of my respect for my grandfather. Having said goodbye to everyone, the girl hurried to the public transport stop, since her relatives had to go in completely different directions. As soon as Helen opened the gate of her grandfather's house, she regretted that she had tried to create the image of an independent and strong person. Of course, she's not too young to be afraid of an empty house. But I've already spent several nights here completely alone, so he can handle it. She began to think again about the reason why the tree occupied such an important place in the life of her relative. Thoughtfully, the girl hand-fed the sad cat, but she felt somehow uneasy being in the house, even in the company of a cat. Helen went out into the yard and, obeying an impulse, approached a tree on which small green fruits were hanging high somewhere. A flock of goosebumps ran down her spine when the girl saw scratches on the ground. There was no doubt. Grandfather George left these marks. It became truly creepy when Helen had the crazy idea that the dying man was scratching the ground not in agony but trying to dig something up. The girl went to the barn, took a small garden trowel from there, and returning to the apple tree, began to carefully dig the ground. Almost immediately, the scoop hit something hard. Helen began to dig with the utmost care and soon pulled out from a shallow hole a solid rectangular package, wrapped in a bag and additionally wrapped with tape. Helen had never heard any stories about family heirlooms and was truly shocked. At home, Helen laid an old towel on the table, which had long been asking for a well-deserved rest somewhere in the trash. put her find on it, and carefully opened the package with a kitchen knife, which grandfather always kept sharp. Under the layers of tape in the bag was a metal candy box. The girl, holding her breath, opened it and saw inside not jewelry or money but papers. Under the folded notebook leaves, clearly covered with grandmother's even handwriting, there were envelopes. Judging by the fact that the package was quite modern, with the emblem of a chain supermarket, and the paper was neither damp nor yellowed, Helen concluded that the find had not lain in the ground for very long, thinking that nothing bad would happen if she found out what her grandfather was trying to get before his death. Helen began to study the find. It was clearly written by my grandmother. "My dear George, I'm writing you a note, realizing that I have very little time left in this world, and I don't think I have the right to take this secret with me. Forgive me, George, for many years ago, because of love for you, I committed deception and even a crime. It's hard to admit, but it's necessary. You and I were already married then. They sent my daughter to kindergarten, and I returned to work at the post office. Everything was fine with us, so I envied myself. And then I saw a letter addressed to you. The sender was a certain woman. My heart immediately felt bad. I didn't give you the letter. I secretly read it myself. That's how I found out about your novel. Your sweetheart reported that it was her strict father who arranged your separation back in 1964. He threatened to kill you or put you in jail using his connections. In fact, he left her the only way, to tell you, looking into your eyes, that he doesn't love you at all and doesn't want to see you ever again. The mother tried to stand up for her daughter, but it did not help. The woman was simply beaten by her own husband because she dared to say a word in defiance. I looked at what your father had done and was terribly afraid for you. That's why she said convincingly everything she was told. After this cruel confession, you predictably flared up, packed your things, took an apple tree seedling as a souvenir for your parents and returned. Legsons of a woman in the letter reported that she was pregnant with your child, and to cover up her sin, she was married off without an official signature to some widower with numerous children in a remote settlement that didn't even have a name. I read the letter in the dark, wet with tears, and even began to sympathize with your young beloved. She complained that her family life did not work out. The man with whom she had to live perceived her as a servant, but despite the scandals with relatives, Alina named the girl she was born your daughter in honor of her mother Sophie. The unfortunate young mother found herself literally in slavery. She endured beatings, humiliation, and tirelessly planned her escape. When my daughter began to grow up, Alien became even heavier. The native children of this so-called husband began to mock the girl, and her mother could not say a word in defense. The beatings began immediately. Only 5 years later, Alien still managed to escape from her husband. She did not give details, but because even the letters at this point were blurred from tears spilled on the paper, it was clear it was very difficult. Alien asked that you come to these very settlements for her and her daughter. She wrote that she would be waiting for you. When I read the letter, it was as if I had gone blind and deaf at the same time. I really didn't understand how I should continue to live. Giving you the messages meant losing my family, and our son was only 3 years old. How could I deprive his father with my own hands? How would he grow up without you? I repent. That first letter, I then destroyed it and threw it in the oven. I thought I protected my family. I shouldn't have hoped. Alien continued to send letters. The next one came almost a year later. Apparently, she planned for you to receive news from her and your daughter on your birthday. She asked why you don't answer her. How scared I was then that she would get ready and come to you. The distance is not particularly long, maybe a little more than 300 kilometers or something like that. It turns out that almost next door to us live those who are capable of destroying my life. If I can burn the letters, then the problem with Sophie is more complicated. What am I supposed to do with a woman and child? I started thinking about how I could prevent them from coming to you. I wrote a letter copying your handwriting on your behalf just in case. I promised that I would come as soon as I could. You probably don't even remember how I tried to persuade you to move, but you never agreed. So I lived like on a volcano. I didn't know how to protect my happiness, how to preserve it if you found out the truth about yours. At work, I also didn't take any vacation or sick leave because of this. Then you realized, 5 years later, that only once a year does this woman bother you. I felt a little better. I burned the letters for a long time, several years, and then I felt ashamed. I started hiding them. I knew that there were places in the house that you would never think of getting into. The only thing is, because of my own fears, I couldn't leave my post office and refused the more promising position. Well, it's okay, I'm used to it. How long did she write to you? But I only saved 10 messages with the last letter that arrived in 1994, and I acted completely meanly. And that she wrote that her health had become completely bad and that she needed medication. And although Sophie tries to support her, there's always not enough money. It's clear. It was such a time then, the whole country was in a fever. She didn't ask or anything for herself. But, of course, I couldn't completely calm down. What if the difficult one brings her to our region? What if she decides to see you? I carefully printed this envelope and returned it with the note the addressee has left. After that, the stream of letters from Alien completely dried up. Why should I have done this before? And I don't understand it myself. There wouldn't be a problem in the first place. And now I don't know what to do with the letters. By right and conscience, you should read them, but not during my lifetime. So, when you find out the bitter story of Ali and your daughter, I will no longer be there. Sorry for being selfish, but I couldn't do otherwise. She loved you too much and didn't want to leave her son without a father. Now I don't care anymore. Gina has also grown up a long time ago, and his granddaughter is a bride. So the path to Alien is clear. I only ask you one thing. Wait at least a year after I leave before looking for your first love and daughter, whom you have never seen. Maintain this period of mourning in honor of all the good things that happened between us. And then do as your heart tells you. Forgive me for everything. Loving you, Kristen. Helen was shocked when she read the note. The story of tragic love, many years of deception, and difficult confession involuntarily touched her. The girl thought that probably Kristen's grandmother should have kept her secret forever. On the other hand, she understood that this was too cowardly. Of course, it's easier to judge from the outside than to find yourself in such a stalemate. And Helen couldn't imagine what she would have done in her grandmother's place. Would you immediately tell your legal husband that his friend still loves him and is waiting for him, together with their common daughter, or would you try by any means within your imagination to protect him from this literally stunning information? It became clear to Helen what Grandpa George wanted to talk to her about. Surely, since the 1-year reprieve that Grandmother Kristen asked him for was coming to an end, he wanted to get advice on how to find his old lover. After all, a lot of time has passed, and it is possible that this alien has long since changed the common surname Smith. Her daughter, Helen's blood sister and her father's daughter, could also probably be married. Trying to distract myself from the unexpected information received, Helen put the papers back into the box, put it in the closet, and began reading the letters that Alien had sent to her grandfather. You never know what other details of the personal life of a loved one will be revealed. So alone, except for the cat, she fell into a light sleep. It was boring, and Helen started cleaning, although there was no particular need for this. The girl took out a bucket of dirty water to throw it into the far corner of the site and saw a car drive up to the gate. Helen's parents, who had finally returned from abroad, got out of the car and she was incredibly happy. Even though this meeting was tinged with bitterness, at least the worry for the parents receded from the heart. During the confused conversation, it turned out that they had arrived in a place where there was no connection or access to the internet. Michael and Anne, having reached civilization, received a sad message from their daughter just before the funeral of Grandfather George and hurried to return, but were still late. Helen was glad that she now had the support she needed so much. After hugs and tears, when everyone was already sitting at the table, the girl began to tell her dad and mom about the unusual find. To prove her words, the girl took out a box from the closet together with her parents. She once again read aloud Grandma Kristen's handwritten confession, and then they studied the surviving letters. One of them contained a photo from a photo studio. It depicted two pretty girls, and there was clearly a kinship in the appearance of the beauties, but they looked more like sisters with a not very big age difference. However, the inscription on the back of the photograph indicated that this was the first love of Grandfather George and their common daughter Sophie. In beautiful handwriting it was written, "In memory of my beloved George from Alien and Sophie on her 16th birthday. We look forward to meeting you. 1981. Michael, forgetting about his respectability, even whistled, "Yes." To say that I'm surprised is to say nothing at all. How did Mom manage to keep all this a secret for so many years and not give away her knowledge? I can't even imagine. Anne, who had a wonderful relationship with her calm mother-in-law, contrary to all stereotypes and ideas about the peculiarities of the family way of life, was also perplexed. They had so many heart-to-heart conversations, but Kristen never said a word that somewhere far away her official husband had a beloved and illegitimate daughter. It was not easy to come to terms with such news. Anne asked, "Do you think we should find your sister and her mother, if she's still alive, of course, or let everything remain as it is?" The man himself did not know how to react to what was happening. Judging by what he learned from his daughter, the father wanted the secret of his youth to be known. On the other hand, is it ethical now to intrude into the fate of a stranger, but a woman related by blood? She appears to be about 50 years old now, and this same alien is most likely now approaching 70. A reminder of her difficult youth and the man she once loved so much but never got to see could be harmful to her health. In addition, as Kristen's grandmother wrote, after she sent back the letter marked the addressee has dropped out, they stopped coming at all. This could mean that Alien believed the lie or that she was desperate. However, alas, the most unfavorable events in the fate of the woman and her daughter could have happened, Byrne said, as if voicing her thoughts out loud. But still, it seems to me that we should at least try to find my grandfather's daughter just to somehow rehabilitate him. After all, it's not Grandpa George's fault that everything turned out this way. I think it would be fair if the whole truth became known to Alien, and of course Sophie. Listen, Dad. The girl turned to Michael. How do you feel knowing that you have an older blood sister? Do you want to see her and chat? The man was confused and asked his daughter in response. And you, Helen, this is Sophie. Actually, Auntie, that's what you have to do. It turns out that it's interesting to meet her. Helen listened to herself and admitted, curious and a little scary. Opinions in the family were divided. Anne, after listening to her husband and daughter, said, "It seems to me that we should leave everything as it is. There is no need now to disturb something that has long been forgotten. More than half a century has passed. Maybe this alien is happy with another person. And hello, meet, so to speak, relatives." I think this is not entirely correct. A long conversation did not help find a compromise. In addition, all family members themselves were not sure of the correctness of their thoughts. As a result, the father went to bed in order to visit the place of George's final resting place in the morning. "Sorry, Dad, I'm late," Michael whispered, standing by a fresh mound covered with wreaths. "I never could have imagined that we wouldn't see each other again." The man put 4 scarlet carnations on the empty space and bowed his head, hiding his tears. After Michael, flowers were laid on George's grave by his daughter-in-law and granddaughter. Each of the grieving relatives realized that they were subconsciously waiting for a sign on how to deal with the information that had fallen on them. They didn't talk about it out loud, but Michael, Anne, and Helen were waiting for a revelation to descend on them. Perhaps it was naive and stupid, but I would really like to know what George himself wanted. No matter how much they hoped for a clue, they could not get it, and with a heavy heart they returned to the apartment. We decided that Michael would live in the house for now, and that his wife and daughter would come to him in their free time. While Anne helped her husband pack at least the minimum necessary things, Helen hurried to the nearest store to buy some special food that was tastier for the yearning cat. The girl felt very sorry for the cat, who seemed to have suddenly lost his luster and lost his previously excellent appetite. After consulting with a serious-looking woman who was busily putting bags of wet food into the cart, Helen collected some gifts for her grandfather's pet and returned home, handing her dad a bag of food. "My dear, I'll ask. He is now a little capricious and may refuse food. Try to feed him from the palm of your hand. He usually starts eating as a sign of respect." He smiled at his daughter. "No, don't worry. I won't offend the tailed one. The days flew by. Just keep up with them." Helen, her mother, went to work, and in the evenings they talked about everything, as the girls were accustomed to from early childhood. Of course, they also talked about the secret that Grandma Kristen had been hiding for. We decided to gather our relatives. We sat together mentally, remembering various incidents from the past. Michael carefully tried to beg it from his great-uncle. "Stepan, can you tell us anything about Dad's youth?" The older man was happy to talk. George was always brave for any good cause, responsive and decisive. When he returned from the army, he went to the factory to get a job in the personnel department. As his mother later said, he heard from someone that young people from our city were sent to build villages and do household work. It was no longer a new thing then. Everyone in the country wanted to help. The people acted in unison. So George, after returning from military service, decided that he would be more useful there. I admit, I also wanted to go with him, but where should I go? In total at that time, I was 15 years old. George is 5 years older than me. In general, he went far. Fortunately, in the Army, he learned to drive a truck and received a license. He returned almost 5 years later. I brought saplings, as if as a souvenir of my long business trip. Of course, he has changed during this time. A naive boy left, but an almost grown man returned. Not because I'm related, but to be fair, I'll say that George definitely hasn't become any worse. I think she can find such Sophie now. His hands are golden and his character is worthy. When here at the automobile plant, they accepted him with open arms. Teetotal, hardworking, honest. What more could you ask for? Hungry for work, and so he will take off his last shirt and give it to someone else. Oh, and the men respected him. No matter what, he never refused. Well, women generally died for him, and he treated everyone very respectfully. Then he married Kristen. She worked at the post office, and somehow the company car broke down, and George was driving by and couldn't leave his fellow driver in trouble. That's how we met. We met briefly and signed, and see, my mother was even offended. It seemed like the holiday was squeezed. But since you, Gina, were born, George was happy. Here in the yard, relatives, neighbors, and colleagues staged a big party. Everyone was invited. It seemed like there weren't any delicacies on the table, but come on, that's not the main thing. It turns out that the atmosphere is much more important. Yes, there was a time when all the neighbors lived almost like relatives. Stefan Alexandrovich interrupted his memories to quench his thirst with a cool, tasty compote. And although he didn't manage to learn anything new that his son didn't know, it was still nice to hear kind words addressed to George. After only Michael, Anne, and Helen remained in the house, the female part of the family cleaned up, leaving the only man, apart from the cat, to dismantle the makeshift benches. Helen went to bed on her favorite cot, and she had a strange, incredibly realistic dream. The girl was not even afraid when she saw Grandfather George at his favorite apple tree. The man stood under the tree, gently stroking the bark and looking at his granddaughter, asking, "When the apples ripen, take a few and give them to those you know. Don't forget, Helen. Please don't forget." Grandfather George looked somewhere, of just trying to see what was happening behind his granddaughter's shoulder. Helen turned to see what or who interested the man, but it was empty. When the girl's gaze returned to the apple tree, Grandfather was no longer under the canopy. Outside the window, birds whistled and sang, tearing Helen out of the captivity of sleep, which left behind a vivid impression. There were no doubts left. Grandfather George conveyed the news, the very sign that was so missing to make the right decision. Of course, he made his desire clear. At his request, Kristen Helen must go on a trip in the fall so that her grandfather's longtime beloved and their common daughter will find out the whole truth. Shocked, Helen did not hide from her parents that she saw Grandfather George in a dream. Michael was even a little annoyed that the late father in his dreams visited not him, but his granddaughter. But wise Anne supported both her husband and daughter, so it was necessary. There, beyond reality, there are probably its own rules. In anticipation of the holiday, the whole family began preparing for Helen's upcoming trip. The girl's attempts to find Enya and Sophie on social networks were unsuccessful, although she patiently looked through hundreds of pages of users from various regions, and not just from that area. Helen planned to hit the road on the first day of her vacation, so as not to delay the resolution of the issue, which had already been postponed for many years by the will of Kristen's grandmother. The girl's parents, trying not to show their excitement, helped their daughter get ready. They reacted most responsibly to the upcoming transportation of apples, which Grandfather ordered to take with and placed a rectangular basket without a handle in a rather compact but roomy sports bag. She carefully placed the ripe fruits there, laying each layer with parchment paper on her husband's advice, and the main load, carefully covered with a towel, was packed. Helen added the minimum amount of things to her bag and hit the road. At the girl's request, her parents only accompanied her to the taxi, and although the daughter promised to call and report the results of the search, Anne and Michael were worried about their daughter. It is not at all a fact that the search expedition will be successful, and a meeting with a woman from George Ilyach's past could lead to completely unpredictable results. Thanks to a carefully thought-out route and the absence of any unforeseen circumstances, Helen easily reached the village from where Grandfather George had been receiving letters for so long, some of which he was able to read only after his wife's death. The local villages seemed to the girl to be quite a cozy settlement. The coming autumn had already touched the trees with gold and made the village especially picturesque. Private houses coexisted peacefully with apartment buildings, near which in some places there were small vegetable gardens and even greenhouses. The girl approached the house, the address of which was indicated on the envelope. An intercom was installed on the entrance door of a typical 5-story building, and Helen froze for a few seconds in indecision. She, although she was preparing mentally for the trip and even diligently prepared a short speech before the difficult explanation, suddenly became scared. Having overcome herself, Helen typed the number of the apartment she was interested in on the keyboard. Hearing a pleasant female voice from the speakers of the device, the girl asked, he shuddered. "Hello, excuse me, please. Can I talk to Alien and her daughter Sophie? Come in." It came from the speaker, and the door opened. Helen was very surprised that the stranger, whose voice sounded from the speakers, did not ask her either her name or the purpose of meeting her. But there was no time to think. Breathing deeply to calm down, the girl went up to the second floor she needed, where a not-quite-old woman was already waiting for her behind the open door. Helen peered into her face, but in vain. I tried to recognize the stranger Sophie. How, given the fact that in the photograph she was captured at the height of her young 16 years and more than 3 decades had passed, it was unlikely that such drastic changes could have occurred. Outwardly, the woman was of a completely different type, and she looked at most about 40 years old, maybe a little bit older. Is it possible to accurately determine age by the appearance of modern women who take care of themselves, to which the stranger undoubtedly belonged? Helen greeted warmly. "Hello again. I was the one who bothered you. Tell me, please, how can I talk to Alien and Sophie?" The woman conducted the conversation freely, even in a brotherly way, as if she had known Helen for many years. Hello, if you're not joking. From what regions did you come? The question surprised Helen, but she answered honestly, although she did not understand why it mattered. The woman, hearing the name of the city, softened and invited her to enter the apartment, where she asked another strange question. "What are your grandfather's last names?" "My grandfather's last name on my father's side is Johnson, and on my mother's side, Adrian." The uttered phrase had a strange effect on the woman. She didn't ask any more questions. She began to fuss. Despite Helen's excuses, she led her into the kitchen through her plate of delicious rosy pies. She offered tea, coffee, homemade compote, and, holding out a glass of sweet drink to the guests, my mom's best friend was Sophie. She was like a caring nanny and an older sister to me. They survived together even when there was nothing special to eat except potatoes grown in a vacant lot. Meat was seen occasionally, but Alien, as she was planting, was so worried and afraid, and she hoped that one day they would look for her. I firmly told my mother not to tell anyone how to find her and her daughter, except for the man with the last name Johnson or his descendants. She was deeply in love with a certain George Johnson. The daughter is the fruit of their sinful and sweet love. Yes, that's right, George Johnson, my grandfather. Helen confirmed her comment. He passed away recently. Only after this did it become clear that his first love and their common daughter once lived here in your apartment at this very address. It's not Grandpa George's fault that he didn't find them earlier. This is how the circumstances developed. The landlady took a notebook from the closet, tore out a piece of paper, took a pen and flipped through the pages. I began to rewrite something, not forgetting to show cordiality. "You eat, drink. Perhaps you rushed here straight from the station. Refresh yourself. Otherwise, in order to meet Alien or daughter, to meet again on the road, you will have to go to another city." They moved. We had to, although it was incredibly difficult for us to part. They became almost family. But after Aunt Alien encountered an acquaintance of the man who kept her as a slave, she was afraid to stay here. It's easier to get lost in a big city. Here you go. I texted you their address and Sophie's phone number to arrange a meeting. Knowing Aunt Alien, I am sure that she is still waiting for news about her beloved. But it's better if you and Sophie discuss the time and place of the meeting. Things aren't going well in their house. My daughter got an extremely nasty husband. When I saw him for the first time, can you imagine? I was even scared. It seems like a person is standing, smiling at you, and his eyes are contemptuous and angry. As my aunt later told me, he helped my daughter a lot in some way when she got a new job in the city, and she fell in love without noticing any of his shortcomings. When I saw it, it was too late. like a fly caught in a web. No matter how hard his aunt tries to get him away from his daughter, it just doesn't work. Lessons, the woman fell silent. Apparently, she herself was worried about this situation, but she did not know how to help the woman whom she considered practically her sister. Helen tried not to look like she was from a hungry region, but she was also unable to refuse the tasty treat and belatedly remembered the rules of etiquette. "Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself, Helen. My name is." "Thank you very much. Your pies are very tasty and the compote is simply wonderful." The woman was very cutely embarrassed. "Me? Come on. It's me who attacked with interrogation. My name is Alice. By the way, an alien taught me to cook. She is generally a master at cooking. Listen, Helen, do you have money for the trip? A taxi will cost more, but it will be faster than taking a train. Sorry, it's not much, but I can give you $50. Helen was deeply shocked by this proposal. Alice seems to be a completely modern young woman in her simple-minded and open behavior, like good characters from old films that grandparents love to watch. Such a friendly attitude brought tears to Helen's eyes, and she hastened to calm Alice down. "Don't worry, my finances are fine. Thank you, Alice. I'm very glad to meet you. Thank you for the treat. It's time to move on." Helen looked at the cost of a taxi to her destination in the app and sighed. "Yes, you're right. The price tag is something incredible. It doesn't matter. I'd love to take a ride on the train." Alice didn't let her guess go so easily. "Mate, now we'll look at the schedule of electric trains and passing trains on the internet. Maybe we'll even book a ticket right away. Why are you toiling around in the waiting room in vain? It's better to keep me company here." "It's true." Helen nodded, agreeing with Alice's wisdom. But the precaution turned out to be unnecessary. It turned out that given the time it takes to get to the station, you almost have to say goodbye to the hospitable woman. Almost leaving the apartment, Helen hesitated for a while. Opening the bag, she took out several large fragrant apples and handed them to Alice. "Here, these are apples from my grandfather's orchard. They are very tasty. I don't know how else to thank you for such a warm welcome." Alice was embarrassed again, but accepted the apples. "I can't resist such an incredible aroma and beauty. They are just like the picture. Say hi to Sophie. By the way, I'll probably, with your permission, warn her that you're going to see them. Let her somehow prepare an Oya. Otherwise, you never know, the blood pressure will jump, the heart will catch, or something else." Helen had no objections, and having said a warm goodbye to her new friend, the girl went to the station. Already with the sound of wheels, she sent her parents a detailed story about how the responsive Alice greeted her. She said that Alien and Sophie had moved, but she had their new address. The mother, who was clearly worried about her daughter, responded almost instantly and asked her to be careful on the road. The girl with a light heart promised to look around carefully and not get involved in any dubious adventures. Fortunately, the situation in the carriage was quite calm. Someone peered thoughtfully at the landscape outside the window, becoming less and less visible due to the approaching darkness. Some of the random fellow passengers were dozing, and Helen regretted that she could not, like most passengers in the carriage, immerse herself in communication with a smartphone. The charge level forced me to refrain from this luxury. Almost at the moment when the previous day crossed the border of night to remain forever in the past, Helen found herself in an ancient town standing on the... The girl thought with belated regret that she had not thought to book a hotel room in advance, because showing up at a stranger's apartment at such a late time was somehow completely awkward. The girl felt a little uneasy, but ordering herself not to be a coward, she quickly figured out how to get to the nearest hotel before her smartphone was completely discharged. Luck was with Helen. The administrator, smiling, even seemed to sincerely offer a small, but, in her words, a very cozy room. Soon Helen settled into her temporary housing and, having put her smartphone on charge, took a shower, had dinner, and lay down on the... Although it was late, the mattress was comfortable, no loud sounds penetrated the hotel room, and there was no sleep in either eye. Still, there is a meeting in the morning, for which she went on a trip, and the anxiety appeared again. The girl was thinking for the 100th time about what to say to the innocent victim of deception and how to apologize for her grandmother, and in general, in what style to conduct the conversation. After all, if, with the good-natured Alice, everything somehow turned out very naturally, this does not mean that communication with Alae and Sophie will be just as pleasant. Although she managed to fall asleep only in the morning, Helen woke up a few minutes before the alarm clock, thanks to the girl's youth. The anxious night did not leave any noticeable marks on her appearance, and at 10, she decided to call Sophie. The woman answered almost instantly. It seemed as if she was expecting this call. It is quite likely that this was the case. After all, it's not very often that there are such meetings of relatives who had no idea about each other. Having quickly agreed to meet in one of the cafes located near the hotel, Sophie was the first to end the conversation. Surprisingly, the choice of a neutral public place for the meeting finally calmed Helen, for whom her recent acquaintance with Alice made the most pleasant and even encouraging impression. Well, such a sweet, kind woman simply cannot be friends and consider bad Sophie her family. This means that they are at least quite adequate. In addition, in a cafe surrounded by Sophie, she is unlikely to reach a violent expression of emotions, and there is less risk that Alien will get too nervous. The girl transferred the basket of apples into a spacious shopping bag, which she had prudently taken with her, and went to the meeting. As Helen approached the cafe, she noticed a slender woman on the porch of the establishment, in whose features it was quite possible to see the girl from the photograph from the letter. The girl was the first to say hello and introduce herself. "Hey, hello, Sophie. I'm Helen Johnson. It turns out that my grandfather is your dad," the woman smiled. "Very nice. I tell you quite sincerely, Alice told me that she had wonderful impressions of communication, and her opinion, as life has shown, must be trusted. But let's go. I'll introduce you to Mom, and we'll talk calmly. She's waiting for us inside." The acquaintance procedure turned out to be unusually calm. Alien behaved affably, but with poorly concealed interest, peering into the face of the granddaughter of her beloved man. To somehow break the prolonged silence, Helen handed the woman a berry. "Here, these are apples from your grandfather's orchard." Alien looked up from studying her face and, looking inside the bag, gasped, "No." The woman carefully took out one fruit, looking at it, holding it tenderly, as if the apple were a living creature, and, without addressing either Helen or her daughter, she spoke quietly. It was noticeable that she wanted to express all the accumulated pain. "George and I once dreamed that we would live in a house near which an apple tree would definitely grow. Not just like a fruit tree, but also seemingly in honor of me. What a pity that our dreams did not come true. When we met, I was only 15 years old. However, in my native land, all girls grow up early, mature for family life with a loved one. George was 9 years older. This age difference did not bother me at all. I deceived him. She said that they were already adults, and he couldn't even think that I was lying. We loved each other, forgetting about everything in the world. Probably as punishment for my lies and this sin, higher powers forced me to. Moreover, this terrible punishment also affects my daughter." The woman stroked the hand of her daughter sitting next to her, who blushed like boiled crayfish and fell silent. Helen, listening and without interrupting, "It's not at all that higher powers intervened in your life. Everything is much simpler and more offensive. Grandfather George, I received some of your letters only after the death of my wife, my grandmother." Helen told in detail everything she knew, and, not forgetting to mention her strange dream. "Someday, mate, so I came here so that you know everything. Both my parents and I thought it would be fair. I'm very sorry that your love had such a tragic story, but now nothing can be fixed." Alien held an apple in one hand, pressing it to her heart with her palm, and with the other she wiped away the tears that stubbornly rolled down her cheeks. Neither Sophie nor Helen knew what to say or how to calm the woman in this grief. The silence was like an unspoken minute of silence over George's death. "They haven't ordered drinks or food yet." Alien, as if waking up from a daze, suggested, "My dears, maybe we can walk along the street. I'm missing some air." Helen and Sophie agreed without hesitation, although the waiter, who did not wait for the order or at least a tip, simply looked unhappy. Nobody cared about him. 3 representatives of the fair sex reflected on the vicissitudes of fate and how outside interference destroys the most wonderful dreams. My daughter wanted to take the bag of apples, but Alien stopped her. "I'm sorry, but I don't want to part with these apples." Fortunately, the long handles made it possible to hang the bag on your shoulder, so it wasn't too heavy to carry. Alien asked Helen to tell everything she knew about her grandfather. What kind of work he did, what programs he liked to watch, what he liked to eat, and other everyday little things. The woman seemed to absorb the moments that had passed her by and smiled quietly. Perhaps she imagined that she herself had lived next to him all these years. The almost idyllic walk was interrupted by the ringtone of Sophie's mobile phone. The man who called shouted so loudly that even at a distance of the alley, Helen heard everything he said. No, why the hell aren't you at home or at work? I was in a hurry on purpose, driving like crazy. And everything is like in a bad joke. Where are you going? Look, if I find out that you're cheating on me, I'll kill everyone, and you and your mother will fly out of my apartment like little kids. Stately Sophie, listening to the tirade, seemed to become smaller in stature. The lights in her eyes went out, and she answered briefly, "I'll be there now." Alien became noticeably agitated. It seems that the voice of the man who called was well known to her, and this man did not evoke the slightest positive emotions in her. Sophie began to say goodbye to Helen and then turned to her mother. "Listen, I'll run. Boris seems to be on edge already, and you can talk some more. You probably would like to talk about a lot of things." She hurried to leave, and from that moment, the casual conversation seemed to evaporate. The girl understood. The woman was terribly afraid for her daughter, who, as it was easy to understand, was in a relationship with a real tyrant. Soon Alien confirmed the guess of her young companion. "I have the impression that my bitter story of slavery and the power of a cruel, domineering man is now being continued by my daughter. She, however, got married, unlike me, quite officially, and even out of great love. That's how it seemed at least 15 years ago. I was so happy for my daughter. Boris always treated me, and even more so her, with respect. But as soon as he managed to persuade me to add my savings to a shared apartment, the relationship began to deteriorate instantly, gradually. One thing didn't suit him, then another. While I was huddled separately in a rented room, separate from my daughter and son-in-law, I had no idea how everything really was. Then, 5 years ago, I became seriously ill and went on long sick leave. In general, I had to ask Boris to come to their 2-room apartment. It seems that I felt that I had the moral right to do this, but, of course, I felt uneasy. Nothing. She hid her pride somewhere far away and asked to stay with her daughter and Boris. Then I saw that not everything was fine with them. There are always some complaints against my daughter, jealousy, hurtful words. In a milder version than before, the monster oppressed me, but every reproach against Sophie was a punishment for me. Recently, he began to accuse me of infertility, although he himself always repeated that children were not included in his life plans. I get the impression that he is provoking Sophie to divorce, and then when we exchange the apartment, we will get some kind of closet. I now clearly understand that Boris will share everything thoroughly down to every spoon, and that she and I are like 2 blades of grass that can be broken like spitting. I have no legal education. Sophie is also far from this. We cannot afford a good lawyer financially. Helen did not know how to console the unhappy woman who had never in her life been able to lean on a reliable man's shoulder. Instead of rushing into battle with all the troubles yourself, it seems that friendship with Alice's mother is the only bright spot in her life, even if it was not easy. But when no one tries to solve the problems, it is at least morally easier. As soon as I lost my permanent job and started baking at home, the fragile balance collapsed. Somehow everything went downhill. Although the standard of living even seemed to become higher, I can probably pay for my rented apartment again. But here's the irony of fate. I simply began to fear for my daughter's health. How afraid I am that Boris will start raising his hand against Sophie. And now there's something uneasy in my heart, as if some kind of trouble is approaching. Helen, I don't want to involve you in our family squabbles, but come to us, please. With you. Boris should moderate his ambition. He always does this in the presence of strangers, enthusiastically and even selflessly. Plays the role of an exemplary husband. If you ask our neighbors, everyone will probably unanimously say that my Sophie is incredibly lucky to have him. Helen immediately agreed to join us. Soon, after traveling a few bus stops and walking a little along the street, they found themselves inside the apartment. A muffled male voice was heard from one of the rooms. "Now I'll teach you how to greet your husband, because in such fools as you need to put the thought into not wagging your tail in the absence of your legal spouse." Alien opened the door and saw Boris grab Sophie by the neck, lifting her off the floor. In a state of some kind of irrational anger, the woman took the bag of apples from her shoulder and hit her son-in-law on the head with it. The man, having let go of his victim, as if knocked down, collapsed on the floor, freezed from coughing. "Mom, what are you doing? What fly bit you? What if you broke Boreas' skull?" Glenn slowly walked up to the sofa, sat down on it, and asked, "Sophie, nothing will happen to Boris. Better bring me some water with a sedative. My heart is starting to pound." Helen, meanwhile, looked closely at the man. He was clearly not too stunned and was already trying to get up. He looked dumbfounded. Boris was in no hurry to get up and, rubbing the back of his head, angrily collapsed on Alien and began to threaten. "Don't even think that this will be in vain. I'll go and film the beatings at the emergency room and put you, the senile old woman, behind bars." Sophie's hand shook as she handed the cup of medicine to her mother. The woman began to persuade Boris not to get excited, but he only became more unruly and uttered threats. "You'll go and eat gruel until you die, and then you'll die in a government house. And with your health, there's no point in being there." Unexpectedly, Boris's tirade was interrupted by Helen, who unwillingly, along with her grandfather and father, watched a variety of detective series and had, albeit small, but valuable experience in calming down even the most inappropriate office visitors and presumptuous suppliers. "First of all, I'll call the police here right now. I saw with my own eyes how you tried to harm Sophie. So Alien's actions may well qualify as causing grievous bodily harm in self-defense, but you may have much more serious problems. Believe me." Helen herself could not understand how she had the audacity to tell an adult man some numbers of articles of the criminal code emerging from the depths of the subconscious. Stress probably took its toll. She used some legal terms so boldly that Boris, under the furious pressure of the stranger, noticeably became shy, and then, carefully getting up, left the room, saying to his wife, "You're lucky that I have a strong head, otherwise I would have become a widow." When the man left, Helen sat down on the sofa next to Alien. The woman began to apologize to the guest. "Sorry, Helen, that this happened." Low inside the girl was still shaking with anger. She managed to answer almost calmly, "There's nothing to apologize for at all." Sophie, standing near the wall, listened to what was happening in the kitchen, where Boris had gone, and then she rushed there, surprising her mother and Helen. The man was busy climbing through the cabinets in a fit of rage. He threw everything out of them right onto the floor, quietly called out to her son-in-law, "Boris, calm down. I hid my stash a long time ago. As soon as I noticed that the bills began to gradually disappear from there, you won't find anything in the kitchen, don't hope." The man, not knowing where he was stepping, crushed cereals and pasta, left the kitchen, almost knocked down Sophie, who was in his way, and soon slammed the door loudly. And Sophie began to clean up the consequences of the destruction caused by Boris, and Helen, without thinking for long, joined them. In response to the hostess's objections, the girl admitted, "Partly I feel a little guilty for everything that happened, so of course I won't stand aside." The mess in the kitchen was almost eliminated when Boris appeared in the doorway, accompanied by a man in a police uniform. "Hello." Boris invited me to look into the circumstances of the beating. Alien sank into a chair, exhausted. Sophie looked angrily at her husband, who, on the contrary, was jubilant. While the women were cleaning up, he made a fuss and literally dragged a law enforcement officer into the apartment, greatly exaggerating the scale of the conflict, naturally, without telling you that before the ill-fated blow to the back of the head, he almost sent his wife to the next world. Helen was amazed at Boris's impudence and blurted out to eliminate the possibility of a dirty trick from this man with a rotten and petty soul. "Excuse me, can I see your ID?" The lieutenant presented the documents and began the interview. While Elena began to talk about what happened, Helen asked permission to call. The policeman did not interfere, and the girl hurried to dial her father's number. Michael listened to his daughter without interrupting, and then said, "In general, Victor will call you back now. He is well versed in such matters. You put the phone on speakerphone, and I think he will be able to resolve this situation favorably and without unnecessary hassle." Helen's father was not mistaken. Boris's triumphant appearance melted as, during a telephone conversation, the policeman, seeing red prints on Sophie's neck, began to cast disapproving glances at the impudent man. The lawyer insisted that the lieutenant also accept a statement from the woman who had been attacked by her husband. And this speech had a wonderful effect. After the mutually amiable completion of telephone conversations, the man sternly asked Boris, "Are you still saying that your wife's mother hit you with a heavy bag for no reason at all?" The picture of this incident is completely different. You, Boris, practically made a false call and even lied. This case, unfortunately, is not subject to jurisdiction, but it is quite possible to run into a fine. Now I will write everything down as it happened and warn you right away. You don't need to deceive me anymore. When Alien showed her terrible remedy, which she applied to her son-in-law, The policeman could hardly contain his smile and involuntarily admired the large, elegant apples. Boris, having read and signed the document drawn up, showered curses and abuse on his wife, her mother, and their young intercessor who had come from nowhere. The district police officer reprimanded the man, and he left the apartment in a rage. The policeman, turning to Sophie, said, "I will advise you simply as a human being. Do not tolerate such an attitude. Further, as experience shows, similar marriages do not lead to anything good. It's not too late to get a divorce." Sophie thanked the district police officer. "Thank you for your informal approach. We handled the situation fairly." Alien put almost half of the apples Helen had brought in a bag to the district police officer and handed it over with the words, "Please accept it as a token of gratitude. I am very embarrassed that my intemperance caused my son-in-law to disturb you." The district police officer shrugged his shoulders, saying that's the job. And then, as if having thrown off the plaque, he formally asked with admiration in his voice, "How did you manage to grow such beautiful apples? At my parents' dacha this year, almost the entire harvest was destroyed by hail at the ovary stage. What was not beaten rotted during the frost." Alien smiled. "I myself didn't expect to admire such apples. This is a famous variety. The defender generously brought these apples to us from another region, where a seedling was delivered many years ago from a southern country by a very good person, despite the difference in climate. The tree has taken root." The police officer thanked him again for the apples, dictated his phone number just in case, and saying goodbye, left the apartment. Despite the successful solution to the problem, Boris's petty revenge in the form of calling the police turned out to be a rather exhausting event for everyone, Bale jokingly stating, "That's it, we've had enough cleaning for today. Where has this been seen? A girl came to visit us, and we gave her a broom and dustpan. That's it, girls, let's set the table in my room. With this hoard, we will be completely starved." Helen was removed from preparing for the feast, and she hurried to call her dad to report that the conversation with the lawyer had helped her get out of a very difficult situation. Michael and Anne, who knew a noticeably softened version of events from her husband, were relieved when their daughter reported this information. Still, even at 24 years old, Helen remained for her parents the same beloved little girl whom they wanted to protect, to cover with their care like a dome, impenetrable to all kinds of evil. As Alice said, Anna turned out to be an incredibly skilled craftswoman when it comes to food. Helen enjoyed trying the seemingly simple but extremely tasty bassifaye. After tea with delicious and homemade sweets, Sophie asked her guest, "Can we arrange a video conference on Skype with your dad? I would like to get to know my half-brother at least in this remote way." Helen admitted, "My parents also asked me about this, but I didn't know how to offer it. Is it convenient?" Alien threw out her hands. His daughter, "My clever girl, what a good idea you came up with. Come on quickly, set everything up." Just a few minutes later, an image of Michael appeared on the laptop screen. First of all, the man began to ask Alien for forgiveness. "It's difficult for me to talk about this, but the happiness of my parents' family and my, in fact, carefree childhood were actually built on the foundation of your misfortunes. Most likely, if letters from you had fallen into the hands of your father earlier, he would probably have found a way to help you. However, my mother was most likely afraid that he would give up everything and ask for a divorce. And he will go to you and his daughter, whom he never had the chance to meet. I sincerely apologize to you, Sophie. I want you to know that you can always count on me. Helen will leave you my phone number and other contacts. Contact us anytime you need it." Helen sat with the hospitable hostesses until the evening, listening and talking about herself and her family. Despite the rather strange circumstances of meeting, no one felt the slightest awkwardness. "I didn't even think that I would suddenly have such a wonderful niece." Alien, named Sophie for Helen, saw in her a subtle, almost imperceptible resemblance to George. Similar facial features, dimples, the funny habit of wrinkling your nose and frowning when you smile. For so many years, the woman remembered the only man she loved desperately, and then, as if out of habit, she hoped to meet. And now there is no more chance to see each other. It was incredibly sad, and there was only one consolation. George did not forget her and did not betray her. I naively believed what she said then. That's the only thing she could reproach him for, even if she wanted to. Countless times, Alien imagined that she had handled that fateful conversation differently. If only then, more than half a century ago, She had only found the courage to tell her beloved that her father was threatening to kill him if she had offered to run away. However, George would probably have found a more correct way to solve the problem. If only she had honestly told him everything many years ago. Most likely they would now be together as they dreamed. Maybe for Sophie, who would have felt the care and support of her father in her personal life, everything would have turned out much more successfully. Everything would have been much better, and she would not have gotten involved with this slippery, nasty Boris. They incredibly regretted that she was unable to protect her fragile love, but she couldn't blame the woman who became George's legal wife for this. In the end, it was she, even under pressure, who rejected her loved one. This means there is no point in looking for someone to blame on the side. The day turned out to be long, eventful, and after a hearty meal and long conversations, those sitting at the table began to yawn, either one by one or all at the same time. Helen flatly refused to be escorted to the hotel. "Don't worry, please. The taxi will take me directly to the place, so there will be no difficulties. As soon as I'm in my room, I'll let you know right away." Sophie said goodbye to Helen as a close relative, with whom they share not only blood ties but also friendship, before getting into taxi. The girl waved to her new acquaintances for a long time, looking out of the window, and did not notice how Boris, who was holding a grudge, was approaching her from a bench installed at the next entrance. The man believed that it was this strange young upstart, whom he saw today, for the first time in his life, who was to blame for the unsuccessful day. Just think, he grabbed it lightly, but it hurt her why she left the house and didn't even think to inform him. It is clear that the matter is unclean. He, as a husband, had every right to teach her how a decent woman should behave. And this little girl, instead of apologizing, began to argue with him, explaining that she had not done anything wrong, so he cut off her oxygen, a little to discourage her. And then, as luck would have it, the evil fury came at the wrong time and hit him on the head with all. Boris touched the back of his head, feeling a painful lump, and continued to think about the insult that he had to endure. Surely everything would not have turned out at all joyfully for the wife and her foolish mother, if not for an unfamiliar face. The devil dared her to end up in their apartment today. The man was sure that without the support of this educated trash, women would not have dared to blather in his direction. Moreover, he would have been able, most likely would have been able to convince the district police officer that the women were conspiring against him. But this young sheep turned out to have a trump card after the intervention of an obviously competent lawyer who knew all the laws. He, Boris, had to leave the apartment as a beggar, although he also has the right to square meters. However, the battle for them is still ahead. In the meantime, we need to deal with these insolent women. Of course, he's now breaking in on his wife and her mother. It's no use. They were probably locked with all the locks and a chain. But to lie in wait and teach a lesson, that would be right. It was for this reason that Boris sat on the bench, sort of like a predator in ambush, waiting for Sophie to see when the defenseless sheep leaves the herd and finds itself in his power. The man even laughed and was glad that he had found such a comparison. But the wait dragged on. The autumn evening, gentle and merciless, had already begun to hint that the planned hunt would not take place. Boris was trembling, either from suppressed rage or from hunger and cold, and was about to leave. But then the entrance door opened and a girl jumped out into the street. Boris's joy was somewhat premature because the impudent sheep climbed into the taxi. But this only provoked the man. The chase is the chase. Luckily, the cars are nearby. In the meantime, heavy traffic in the city will not allow the future victim to disappear from view. Helen had already grabbed the door handle to the hotel, dreaming of quickly collapsing on the bed and getting some sleep. But she heard a voice behind her. The girl automatically turned around and lost precious fractions of a second. Boris, whose voice she recognized very well, was rapidly approaching her. Helen turned away and, trying to quickly get into the hotel, out of fear began to push the doors in the wrong direction. When finally salvation was close, the man grabbed her by the waist, turned her to face him, and began to threaten her in a falsely affectionate tone. "Where were you in such a hurry? Explain to me, why the hell are you interfering in my family life? Why are you silent, sheep? Who asked you to intervene?" The girl prepared to scream loudly and wondered how to free herself. But I didn't have to look for salvation on my own. She could not see how a district police officer, who was already in civilian clothes, appeared from the slightly open door behind her, but she was incredibly happy when she heard, "Boris, you are completely wrong now. Let the girl go." There were steely notes in the policeman's voice, and Boris instantly loosened his grip, and made excuses to the district police officer. I just came to talk. Then I thought of inviting him for a walk and showing him the city. The policeman, leaving the hotel, asked, "Helen, if you don't mind, wait for me in the foyer. I need to agree on something with Boris." Helen sat down in a comfortable chair. A few minutes later, a local police officer sat down next to him and admitted, I actually came to see you. My parents immediately lost peace when they saw the apples. They asked me to come to an agreement with you about the cuttings. His father wants to vaccinate him and try to grow such beauty too. And I can't count how many times the markets have cheated with varieties. The picture shows one thing, but what emerges is something completely different. So I came here to the hotel, and as it turns out, it's not in vain. The girl smiled. She liked this young and somehow very correct and principled policeman. In gratitude for her salvation, she promised him to send as many Sherenkov as she wanted when she got to her grandfather 2 houses away. They exchanged contacts and said goodbye. The man did not want to part with the charming girl, but he could no longer find any reason to stay close to her. It seems that it was not in vain that Grandfather George sent me to look for Sophie in my dreams. He also advised me to take apples with me. Events after meeting the relatives began to develop with frightening speed. Sophie divorced Boris, and after exchanging the apartment, they moved at the invitation of Michael to his father's house. The man suggested from the bottom of his heart, "Since I am aware of my mother's guilt, let this house be at least a small compensation for all your suffering," and sat for a long time by the apple tree, carefully grown by his loved one, stroking it like a living creature. And Helen, who was always a welcome guest, was glad that the elderly woman, although belatedly, had found peace. In the personal life of the granddaughter, the glossy fruits of the airport also played an important role. Correspondence and regular telephone conversations with Sergio, that policeman, helped to find out that their sympathy is mutual and does not weaken over time, but even becomes stronger. Soon the lieutenant moved to the city to live with his girlfriend, explaining, "Well, our police required everywhere, and if necessary, I can master another profession." Sophie also found her personal happiness when she met a man in a new city. Anna, stroking the apple tree, quietly whispered, "Thank you, George. I know for sure that it was you who helped arrange everything so successfully."